Every farmer in Hardin County, Iowa, had a place where he put things that were too broken to fix and too heavy to haul away. A fence corner, a tree line, the back of the barn where the weeds grew high enough to hide what was there. It's one of the quiet embarrassments of farming, the accumulation of failure. A plow blade that cracked, a hydraulic cylinder that blew, an engine block that seized because someone forgot to check the oil on the wrong day. These things don't disappear when they stop working. They sit where they die, rusting slowly, sinking into the ground, becoming part of the landscape like tombstones for machines that gave everything they had. Most farmers hated looking at their dead equipment. It reminded them of bad seasons, bad luck, bad decisions. So they pushed it out of sight, or they hauled it to a ravine, or they called the scrap man who came through twice a year with a flatbed and paid $8 a ton for anything made of iron. The scrap man was a thin fellow named Wally Bruns who drove a rusted International with a hydraulic arm bolted to the bed, and he treated every farm visit like a funeral. Respectful, quiet, he never commented on the condition of what he hauled. He just weighed it, paid, and drove on to the next place. Wally understood that dead equipment was a sore subject. Nobody bragged about the machines they'd killed, but there was one farmer in Hardin County who didn't hate dead equipment. She loved it. She collected it. She cataloged it. She organized it with a precision that would have impressed a librarian. And for 20 years, everybody laughed at her for it. This is the story of Edith Callaway in the junkyard that saved a county. Hardin County sits in the heart of central Iowa. Rich, flat, black soil prairie that grows corn and soybeans the way other places grow weeds. The topsoil runs 3 feet deep in places, a gift from 10,000 years of tall grass decomposition. And when the sun hits it after a rain, the ground steams like a living thing. In 1966, the county had about 600 active farms, 2 grain elevators, a feed mill, a bank, a co-op, and a John Deere dealership in Eldora, run by a man named Warren Pritchard, who believed that the only good equipment was new equipment, and the only good farmer was the one writing the check. Warren was a big man, tall, barrel-chested. He wore pressed shirts even in July and kept his fingernails clean, which was a statement in a county where clean fingernails meant you hadn't done anything useful that day. His dealership sat on the main road into town, a white metal building with green trim and a row of new tractors parked out front like soldiers at attention. Every spring, Warren washed those tractors and arranged them by size, smallest on the left, largest on the right, so that a farmer driving past would see a progression from modest to magnificent, and Warren hoped feel the pull of ambition. He sold 30 tractors in a good year, 20 in a lean one. He made his money on parts and service, the steady drip of maintenance that keeps a dealer alive between the big sales. Warren understood something fundamental about his business. The machine is the introduction, but the parts are the marriage. Once a farmer bought a John Deere, he was married to Warren's parts counter for the life of the tractor. And Warren priced his parts accordingly. A fuel injector that cost $38 wholesale sold for $68 at Warren's counter. A hydraulic pump that cost $110 went out the door for $240. 300% markup was standard, sometimes more. Warren called it the cost of convenience. His customers called it the cost of having no choice. Edith Callaway was 53 years old in 1966 and had lived on 240 acres on the east side of the county since 1937. That was the year she married Harold Callaway, whose father had homesteaded the land in 1879. 3 generations of Callaways on the same ground. 240 acres. Never more, never less. The land was good, but not exceptional, productive, but not remarkable, the kind of farm that would never make a family rich, but would keep them fed and housed and connected to the earth in the way that only land ownership can provide. Harold's grandfather had cleared the original prairie with a breaking plow and a team of oxen. Harold's father had mechanized with the first farmall tractors in the 20s. Harold had continued the tradition, adding a combine, upgrading the planter, building a proper machine shed in 1955. The farm had one unusual feature, a ravine. A deep, steep-sided gully that ran for about 300 yards along the north boundary of the property, carved by a creek that had long since changed course. The geological surveys said the creek had shifted east sometime in the 1800s, leaving behind this scar in the earth. This wound that time hadn't healed. The ravine was maybe 40 feet wide and 20 feet deep, too steep to plant, too rocky to graze, too irregular to do anything useful with. The sides were a mix of clay and limestone, and in the spring water ran along the bottom from snowmelt and early rains, but by June it was dry. Sumac and wild grape grew on the slopes. A few box elders had taken root along the rim. It was by any farmer's estimation wasted ground, 7 acres of nothing in the middle of some of the best farmland in the state. Harold's father had used it as a dump. When a piece of equipment died, it went into the ravine. He'd back the truck to the edge and let gravity do the rest. By the time Harold took over the farm, there were already a dozen pieces of machinery down there. A horse-drawn cultivator from the 1910s, its iron teeth rusted to the color of dried blood. Two Farmall regular tractors from the 30s, their radiators cracked and their engines locked solid. A threshing machine frame massive and skeletal, like the rib cage of some prehistoric animal. Various plows and harrows, and a section of corn binder that nobody could identify anymore. Iron ghosts of his father's farming life, slowly disappearing into the earth that had been their purpose. Most men would have called the scrap dealer and cleared it out. But it wasn't Harold who had the idea to keep collecting. It was Edith. Let me tell you about the day that changed everything, because every story begins with a single crack, and this one began with the sound of iron bending the wrong way on an October morning in 1964. Harold Calloway was 51 years old, strong in the way that farmers are strong, not from a gym, but from decades of lifting, pulling, carrying, and enduring. He had thick hands with scarred knuckles and a quiet manner that some people mistook for simplicity, but was actually the economy of a man who didn't waste words the way he didn't waste seed or fuel or daylight. He was up before dawn that day, the way he was every day during harvest. October in Iowa is a race. The corn is standing, the weather is turning, and every day you don't pick is a day closer to the snow that will bury what you haven't saved. Harold understood this the way all farmers understand it, not as an idea, but as a physical pressure, a weight in the chest that doesn't lift until the last load is in the elevator and the last stalk is down. He'd gone out to start the Farmall 560, the tractor that pulled the corn picker. The 560 was their workhorse, 73 horsepower. Diesel. Built in 1963 to only a year old, still relatively new by farm standards. But the hydraulic pump had been giving trouble for weeks. A slow leak. Nothing dramatic. Just a film of hydraulic fluid on the housing after a long day's work, a slight hesitation in the lift arms when he raised the corn picker at the end of each row. The pump needed replacing. The part was $68 at Warren Pritchard's dealership. Harold had looked at the price and decided he could nurse it through one more season. Just one more season. That was what farmers always said. One more year out of the brakes. One more harvest out of the clutch. One more season out of the pump. The calculation was always the same. The risk of failure weighed against the cost of prevention, and in farming cost usually won. The pump failed at 7:15 in the morning. Harold was adjusting the corn picker head, standing between the tractor and the implement, reaching for a pin that held the gathering chain tension. The hydraulic line blew. Not a gradual failure, an explosive one. The weakened seal gave way under pressure, and the hydraulic fluid that should have been holding the picker head in its raised position was suddenly spraying into the cold October air. The picker head dropped. 1,200 pounds of iron and steel falling as gravity took over from hydraulics. Harold was pinned between the tractor's drawbar and the falling head of the picker. The impact crushed his chest against the drawbar. He was alone. Edith was in the house. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. There was no sound except the tractor idling and the slow drip of hydraulic fluid onto the ground. Edith found him 40 minutes later when she came out to bring coffee. She was carrying 2 mugs, one black for Harold, one with cream for herself. She set the mugs on the fender of the tractor and tried to lift the picker head with her hands. She couldn't. She ran to the house and called for help. By the time the neighbor arrived with a jack, Harold was gone. His eyes were open. He was looking at the sky. The county coroner listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma, but Edith knew the real cause. A $68 hydraulic pump, a part that should have been replaced. A repair that was deferred because the money wasn't there, or the time wasn't there, or the pride wasn't there to admit the machine needed help. Harold Calloway had survived with 30 years of farming, every storm and drought and flood and market crash that Iowa could throw at a man, And he died because a hydraulic seal failed on a part that cost less than a pair of boots. Edith buried her husband on a Thursday. The funeral was at the Methodist Church in Eldora. Half the county came. Harold was well-liked the way quiet men are often well-liked, not because they demand attention, but because they give it. He listened when people talked. He remembered their problems. He showed up when they needed help. The church was full, and the overflow stood in the fellowship hall and listened through the speakers. The minister said the usual things about rest and peace and the Lord's plan. Edith sat in the front pew and heard none of it. She was thinking about the hydraulic pump. On Friday, she sat in the kitchen and looked out the window at the Farmall 560 still sitting in the field with dried blood on the corn picker head. The October light was flat and gray, the kind of light that makes Iowa look like a photograph of itself drained of color and warmth. She looked at the tractor for a long time. She thought about pushing it into the ravine. She thought about setting it on shear. She thought about driving it into the pond on the South 40 and letting the water swallow it. Then she stood up. She walked out to the barn. She found Harold's shop manual for the 560 and opened it to the hydraulics section. She read every page. She studied every diagram. She traced the lines of the hydraulic system with her finger from the pump to the valves to the cylinders to the lines and back. She memorized every part number. She understood by the end of that afternoon exactly what had failed and exactly why. Then she went to the ravine and looked down at the dead machines, 12 pieces of equipment from 3 generations. She climbed down into the gully, something Harold had never let her do because of the steep sides and the loose rock. The descent was treacherous. She grabbed sumac branches for handholds and placed her feet carefully on the limestone outcroppings that jutted from the clay walls. At the bottom, she walked among the machines. She put her hands on a Farmall regular from 1935. She felt the hydraulic fittings. She checked the pump housing. It was intact, rusted but intact. The pump from a 1935 wouldn't fit a 1963 model. The technology had changed too much. But the principle hadn't. Every machine was made of parts. Every part could be removed, tested, stored, and reused. Every dead tractor was a library of components waiting to be cataloged. She climbed back out of the ravine. Her hands were dirty. Her dress was torn where she'd caught it on a piece of sheet metal. She didn't care. She went to the barn, found a spiral notebook and a grease pencil, and wrote on the first page in neat, deliberate handwriting, Callaway Farm Equipment Salvage. Inventory Volume 1. She was not going to let another farmer die for a $68 part. The county didn't know what to make of Edith Callaway. Not in 1964 when Harold died, and certainly not in 1966 when she started collecting. In 1964, every neighbor within 10 miles assumed she would sell. A widow at 51 with 240 acres and no help coming. Her boy Nolan was not yet a year old, an infant, born that January 8 months before the accident that took his father. Harold had held his son exactly 219 days. Edith counted later. She counted a lot of things later. The farm needed a man, or so the county believed, and the county believed it loudly and often. At the co-op on Saturday mornings, the talk was predictable. Shame about Harold, good man, good farmer. What's Edith going to do? She can't run 240 acres with a baby on her hip. Frank Driscoll at the bank will probably have the place listed by spring. Frank Driscoll at First National Bank was the loudest voice in the choir of doubt. He called Edith into his office 3 weeks after the funeral, sat her down across the big walnut desk that had been in the bank president's office since 1923. The desk was meant to intimidate. It was massive, dark, polished to a mirror finish, and it worked. Most farmers who sat across that desk felt small. That was the point. Frank looked at Edith with the expression of a man who has already decided the outcome of the conversation. Edith, Frank said, you've got 240 acres, a line of credit, and no one to run the equipment. I've had 3 offers on the land already. Good offers, cash buyers. You'd walk away comfortable. Not wealthy, but comfortable. Enough to buy a house in town, put something aside for the boy. Maybe take a job at the county courthouse or the school. There's no shame in it. Lots of widows sell. It's the practical thing. Edith looked at Frank Driscoll the way she would later look at a tractor manual. She studied him. She measured him. She identified his components and his weaknesses. Frank was 62 years old, a banker who'd never planted a seed in his life, who wore a tie every day, including Sundays, who believed that women belonged in kitchens and classrooms, in church committees, and that farming was men's work, the way banking was men's work, the way everything important was men's work. He wasn't cruel, he was conventional. And in 1964, convention was a wall that women ran into every day of their lives. Frank, she said, Harold's been dead 3 weeks. You've had 3 offers. That means you've been making calls. Frank shifted in his chair. The walnut desk suddenly seemed less impressive. The bank has a responsibility to honor the terms of our loan, Edith said. We're current. We've never missed a payment in 27 years. The land is collateral and the land is worth more than the note. You don't have the right to force a sell and you don't have a reason. Edith, you can't farm 240 acres alone with a baby. Watch me. She stood up and walked out. Frank Driscoll sat behind the walnut desk and stared at the empty chair and felt something he rarely felt. Doubt, not about the loan, about the woman. That was November of 1964. By the following October, she'd brought in the corn harvest by herself. Not easily, not gracefully. There were days when the equipment broke and she sat in the cab of the tractor with the baby in a basket on the floor behind the seat and cried from exhaustion and rage and grief. There were nights when she fell asleep in the barn because she was too tired to walk to the house, Nolan sleeping in a crate lined with blankets that she kept near the space heater. There were mornings when she looked at the 560, the tractor that killed Harold, and wanted to push it into the ravine and never look at it again. But she didn't. She fixed it. She replaced the hydraulic pump. She took the shop manual to the workbench and laid out every tool Harold had owned and taught herself step by step how to remove the old pump and install a new one. It took her 3 days. She made mistakes. She stripped a bolt. She dropped a fitting into the engine compartment and spent an hour fishing it out with a magnet on a stick. She got hydraulic fluid in her hair and diesel fuel on her dress and grease under her fingernails that wouldn't come out for a week. But on the 3rd day, she turned the key. The engine started. She raised the hydraulic arms. They lifted smooth and strong. She lowered them. They descended evenly. The pump held. No leak, no hesitation. She sat in the seat of the Farmall 560 and felt the hydraulic pressure through the lever in her hand, and she understood something that Harold had always understood, but never had to put into words. A machine is just a collection of parts, and parts can be mastered, and mastery is power. She cleaned the corn picker. She drove the 560 through the harvest like it owed her something. And when the last load of corn was in the elevator and the check was deposited and Frank Driscoll looked at the account balance and said nothing, Edith went home and sat in the kitchen and opened the spiral notebook and wrote down the first inventory entry. The collecting began in the spring of 1966. It started with a neighbor named Hank Mercer. Hank farmed 320 acres to the west. Good land, slightly higher elevation than the Callaway place, well drained. He'd bought a new John Deere 4020 from Warren Pritchard's dealership trading in his old Farmall 4600. But the 460 had a cracked block, which meant Warren wouldn't take it on trade. A cracked block is a death sentence for a tractor. You can fix almost everything else, but a cracked block means the engine is done. The casting is split. Coolant leaks into the cylinders. Compression is lost. The machine becomes an expensive paperweight. Hank was going to pay Wally Bruns, the scrap man, to haul it away. $8 a ton. The Farmall 460 weighed about 7,000 pounds. So Hank was looking at about $28 for what had been a $12,000 tractor. Don't scrap it, Edith said. She was standing at the fence line between their properties, the way neighbors talked in farm country. Casual, no urgency, like they had all the time in the world. The sun was going down behind the grain bins, painting everything amber. Nolan was 2 years old, sitting in the grass at Edith's feet, pulling dandelion heads apart with his small fingers. Bring it to my place, I'll take it. Hank looked at her the way most men looked at Edith in those days, with a mixture of pity and confusion. The widow who wouldn't sell, the woman who farmed alone with a toddler, the stubborn one. Edith, that tractor's junk. The block's cracked. It's not worth fixing. I don't want to fix it. I want the parts. The hydraulic pump's good. The PTO shaft is good. The rear end's good. The gauges, the seat, the steering column, the fuel injector, the water pump. All good. One cracked block doesn't make a tractor worthless. It makes 90% of the tractor worth saving. Hank shrugged. He was a good neighbor, not a deep thinker, but a reliable man who showed up when he said he would and left other people's business alone. Hauling the farmall to Edith's ravine was easier than waiting for Wally Bruns. He delivered it the next Saturday, backing his flatbed trailer down the lane and dropping the 460 at the edge of the ravine with a chain and a winch. Edith spent that weekend taking the 460 apart, not smashing it with a sledgehammer the way some farmers dismantled dead equipment, hitting it with a heavy tool until pieces broke free, disassembling it carefully, methodically. With wrenches and a socket set and Harold's shop manual open on the workbench, the pages held flat by a pair of pliers on each side. She pulled every salvageable part, cleaned it with diesel fuel and a rag, labeled it with a grease pencil on a strip of masking tape. Make, model, part name, condition, date pulled, and stored it in the barn. The hydraulic pump went on a shelf she'd built from 2x4s and plywood scraps. The PTO shaft hung on a wall hook. The fuel injector went in a coffee can labeled IH460 injectors. The water pump went in a box labeled IH water pumps 300 to 460 Okion series. The alternator went in a separate box. The brake shoes went in a bin. The steering column components went on the floor rack, sorted by size. The empty carcass of the tractor, the frame, the cracked block, the sheet metal went into the ravine, but not thrown. Organized. The frame on one side laid parallel to the existing frames from Harold's father's tractors. The sheet metal stacked flat, the blocks standing upright next to two other blocks. Even in death, even in the ravine, Edith imposed order. And that was how it started. Word spread, not through any effort by Edith. She wasn't the kind of woman who advertised. She didn't talk about herself at the co-op. She didn't post a sign on the road. It spread the way everything spreads in farm country. One neighbor told another, who mentioned it at the grain elevator while waiting for the truck to unload. Edith Calloway's taking dead equipment. Anything you don't want, bring it to her place. She's got a ravine. She'll take anything. Tractors, combines, plows, balers. Doesn't matter what shape it's in. She wants it. The reactions ranged from amusement to bewilderment. A few farmers thought Edith had lost her mind. Grief does that to people, they said. She lost Harold and now she's hoarding dead tractors. Others were more charitable. She's got a system, they said. She's organized about it. Maybe she knows something we don't. But most people fell somewhere in the middle. They didn't understand it, but they didn't need to. Edith was taking their junk for free. That was good enough. Within 2 years, farmers from across the township were bringing their broken, obsolete, worn-out machinery to Edith's farm. A combine header with bent teeth, a grain drill with a seized gearbox, a manure spreader with a rotted floor, the wood planks soft as bread, 2 more tractors, a Farmall H with a blown head gasket, and an Oliver 70 with a cracked manifold, a hay baler that had been sitting behind a barn for 12 years, its plunger frozen solid, its twine mechanism clogged with mud dauber nests, 3 plows with broken shares, an entire set of cultivator shovels from a field cultivator that nobody made parts for anymore because the manufacturer had gone out of business in 1958. Edith took everything. She said yes to every piece that arrived. And she spent her evenings and weekends, the hours other farmers spent watching television, or sitting on the porch, or driving into town for a beer at the roadhouse on Highway 20 in her barn, disassembling, cleaning, labeling, storing. Nolan played on the barn floor while she worked, surrounded by iron and the smell of diesel and the sound of wrenches turning. By 1970, Edith's barn had 412 parts on its shelves, hooks, and floor racks. She knew this because she kept the ledger, the spiral notebook with lined pages where she recorded every part by date of acquisition, source machine condition, and location in the barn. 412 parts organized by brand, model, and function. Cross-referenced in a notebook that Edith updated every time she added or removed a piece. The handwriting was neat, precise, the same handwriting she used for everything: letters to the seed company, checks to the banknotes, to Nolan's teacher when he started school. A hand that didn't waste ink the way Edith didn't waste iron. Nolan, her son, was 6 by then. Too young to help with the heavy work, but old enough to watch. And he watched everything. He watched his mother's hands move over the parts with the care a surgeon gives to instruments. He sat on an overturned bucket in the barn and handed her wrenches when she asked. He learned the names of parts before he learned the names of presidents. Fuel injector, hydraulic pump, PTO shaft, water pump, alternator, starter motor. These were the vocabulary of his childhood. Other children learned their ABCs. Nolan learned his IH part numbers. Now let me tell you how the county reacted, because the reaction is half the story. Warren Pritchard, the John Deere dealer in Eldora, was the first to make it personal. Warren was a salesman to his core, a man who believed that the American farmer's job was to buy equipment and the American dealer's job was to sell it. The relationship was symbiotic in Warren's mind. Farmers produced grain. Dealers produced access to the machines that produced grain. It was a clean, simple system, and Warren liked clean, simple systems because they were profitable. Every used part that Edith pulled from a dead tractor was a new part that Warren didn't sell. Every farmer who drove to Edith's barn instead of Warren's showroom was a customer lost. The math was straightforward. If a farmer bought a used fuel injector from Edith for $15 instead of a new one from Warren for $68, that was $53 that didn't cross Warren's counter. Multiply that by the dozens of farmers who were starting to make the trip to the Callaway place, and Warren was looking at a real number. Not devastating, not yet, but real. But Warren's hostility went deeper than lost sales. Warren Pritchard didn't like Edith Callaway because Edith Callaway didn't need him. She didn't need his dealership. She didn't need his expertise. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need his permission to exist in the agricultural economy of Hardin County. And in a county where a woman farming alone was already an affront to the natural order of things, a woman who built a parts operation from nothing, who could identify a hydraulic pump by the weight in her hand, who knew more about farm-all specifications than most of Warren's own mechanics, was something worse than an affront. She was a threat. Warren didn't say this directly. He never confronted Edith face to face. He said it the way small-town businessmen say things, sideways, at the co-op, loud enough for the right ears. Over coffee and biscuits on Saturday mornings when the farmers gathered at the counter and talked about weather and prices and neighbors. Edith Callaway's running a junkyard out there, Warren told the Saturday morning crowd at the co-op counter one morning in the spring of 1971. He held his coffee cup in both hands and shook his head with the practiced sadness of a man delivering bad news. I drove past yesterday, counted 14 dead tractors, 6 combines, and what looked like the entire undercarriage of a 40-year-old threshing machine. It's an eyesore. It's a safety hazard. Some kid's going to fall into that ravine and break his neck. And it's bad for every equipment dealer in the county, because every farmer who puts a used hydraulic pump on his tractor instead of buying new is a farmer who's cheating the system. Cheating the system was a strong phrase in farm country. It was an accusation, not a legal one, a moral one, a suggestion that Edith was doing something dishonest by saving farmers money on parts, that she was undermining the proper order of commerce, that she was taking food off the table of honest businessmen like Warren Pritchard. The co-op crowd murmured, some nodded, a few defended Edith quietly under their breath. She's not hurting anyone, Warren. She's just a widow with a barn. But most stayed silent. Nobody wanted to cross the John Deere dealer. Warren controlled the service department, and every farmer in the county needed his service department at least twice a year, spring tune-up and fall maintenance. And if you crossed Warren, you might find that your spring tune-up appointment slipped from March to May, which was too late to matter. Then Warren leaned back on his stool and said the thing that stuck. The thing that spread through the county like ragweed seed on a west wind. It's bad enough a woman thinks she can run a farm, Warren said. Now she thinks she can run a salvage yard too. Somebody ought to tell her that playing mechanic in her dead husband's barn doesn't make her a dealer. It makes her a liability. The co-op went quiet, not the quiet of agreement, the quiet of men who knew they'd heard something ugly and didn't want to be the one to say so. A few looked at their coffee. One man, old Earl Nordstrom, who'd farmed the north end of the county for 50 years and didn't suffer fools, stood up from his stool, put $2 on the counter for his coffee and eggs, and walked out without finishing his biscuit. He didn't say a word, but the way he left, the deliberateness of it, the way he set his jaw and didn't look at Warren as he passed, said what needed saying. Nobody else moved. And the word junkyard stuck. The county got involved in 1973. not by accident, by design. Warren Pritchard had been building his case for years, talking at the co-op, talking at the bank, talking at the Farm Bureau meetings, talking at the church picnic and the 4th of July celebration and the county fair where he sponsored the tractor pull every year and made sure his name was on the banner. Planting the idea slowly and steadily that Edith's operation was something more than a woman with a hobby. That it was a commercial salvage yard operating without permits, without insurance, without zoning approval. That it was depressing property values in the surrounding section. That it was a danger to children who might wander into the ravine and fall 20 feet onto rusting iron. In the spring of 1973, a complaint was filed with the county. Not one complaint. Five. Five farmers signed a petition requesting that the county investigate the unlicensed salvage operation on the Callaway property. The petition cited safety concerns, environmental hazards, specifically the potential for hydraulic fluid and diesel fuel to contaminate groundwater, and negative impact on surrounding land values. Everyone knew where the petition came from. Warren's fingerprints were on every sentence. The language was too polished for farmers. The concerns were too specific. The mention of groundwater contamination was a touch that had lawyer written on it, and Warren's brother-in-law was a lawyer in Iowa Falls. But the five names on the paper were real farmers, real neighbors, men whose equipment Edith had been collecting, men who'd driven their dead tractors to her ravine and thanked her for taking them. Three of the five names had received free parts from Edith's barn in the previous 2 years. Gene Lutz, Donald Rask, Floyd Embry, three men who had stood in Edith's barn, taken parts from her shelves and paid nothing, and then signed a paper saying she should be shut down. The county scheduled a public hearing for June 15th. Vernon Osgood, the zoning officer, would preside. The hearing would be held in the county courthouse in Eldora, open to the public. Edith found out about the hearing the way she found out about most things that concerned her. Someone told someone who mentioned it at the grain elevator. She drove home that afternoon, parked the truck, checked on Nolan, who was 9, and watching television after school, and walked to the barn. She sat on her stool at the workbench for a long time, looking at the shelves of labeled parts, the coffee cans in their neat rows, the notebooks stacked on the corner of the bench. She didn't cry. She cried enough in 1964. Crying was a luxury she'd used up on Harold. What remained was something harder, something that didn't bend under weight but absorbed it. She opened the current notebook, volume 4, and counted the names. 87 farmers had received parts from her barn since 1966. 87. She went through the entries one by one, her finger tracing the lines of her own handwriting, and she noted the names of the 5 petitioners, found them in the ledger, noted what they'd received, what they'd paid, which in 3 cases was nothing, what condition the part had been in when she'd given it to them. Then she got dressed for the hearing. The courthouse was fuller than Vernon Osgood expected. 40 people in a room built for 30. Farmers in clean shirts and work pants, their good boots, the ones they wore to church and funerals and the occasional trip to Des Moines. Their wives sat in the back row, a few with small children on their laps. Warren Pritchard sat in the front row, arms crossed, wearing a tie. He'd brought his brother-in-law, the lawyer from Iowa Falls, who sat beside him with the yellow legal pad. Edith sat alone at the respondents' table. No lawyer, no advocate, no one beside her. She wore a blue dress that she hadn't worn since Harold's funeral, and she carried the ledger notebooks, all 4 volumes. She stacked them in front of her like evidence, which is exactly what they were. Vernon Osgood, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses in a manner that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, read the complaint aloud. Unlicensed commercial salvage operation. Safety hazard. Environmental concern. Property value impact. He read it in a monotone, the way bureaucrats read things they're required to read but don't particularly care about. Then he looked at Edith over his glasses. "Mrs. Callaway, you may respond." Edith stood. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She weighed 128 pounds. She looked like somebody's grandmother, which she was not yet, though she would be someday. She looked like a woman who baked pies and hung laundry and sat in a pew on Sunday and went home to a quiet house. She did not look like a woman who could disassemble a Farmall 460, in a weekend identify a hydraulic pump by the weight in her hand, or tell you the part number of every fuel injector International Harvester made between 1945 and 1970. She opened volume one of the ledger. I'm not running a commercial anything, Edith said. Her voice was steady, quiet, the kind of quiet that makes people lean forward to hear, that makes a room go still. I'm a farmer with a ravine full of equipment that other farmers gave me. I don't buy it. I don't advertise it. If someone needs a part and I've got it, I give it to them or trade for something I need. That's not commerce. That's neighborly. She paused, looked at the 5 petitioners in the audience, found their faces, held their eyes. I'd like to read some names, if that's all right. Vernon nodded. Edith read from the ledger. Her voice was even. She didn't emphasize. She didn't dramatize. She just read the facts. March 1969. Lyle Sundberg, alternator for a Farmall Chief 6-0, no charge. Mr. Sundberg's tractor had failed during spring planting. I had the alternator on my shelf. He was back in the field the next day. October 1970. Dale Krumholtz, PTO shaft for a John Deere B, traded for 40 pounds of seed corn. Mr. Krumholtz needed the shaft for hay grinding before winter. The nearest dealer was Marshalltown, and they didn't stock parts for a Model B. August 1971, Howard Schilling, steering gearbox for an Oliver 77, no charge. Mr. Schilling is 74 years old and couldn't afford the dealer price. She kept reading, name after name, date after date, part after part, 87 entries spanning 7 years. The room was silent except for Edith's voice and the scratch of the lawyer's pen on his legal pad. Some of the men she named were sitting in the audience. They looked at their hands. They looked at the floor. They looked at anything that wasn't Edith Calloway reading their names from a notebook and reminding them of the day they came to her barn with a problem and left with a solution. Then Edith read 3 more names. February 1971, Gene Lutz, water pump for a Farmall H, no charge. Mr. Lutz's tractor was his only tractor. He had 80 acres and no money for a new pump. I gave him one from a Farmall H I'd salvaged in 1968. He's still using it. Gene Lutz had signed the petition. May 1972. Donald Rask, brake shoes for a Farmall 806, traded for fence repair. Mr. Rask's brakes were unsafe. His tractor had rolled on a hill because it couldn't stop. I traded the brake shoes for a day of fence work on my south line. Donald Rask had signed the petition. November 1972. Floyd Embry, fuel line assembly for a John Deere 720, no charge. Mr. Embry's fuel line cracked in cold weather. He was losing diesel on the ground. I had a replacement from a 720 I'd salvaged in 1969. Floyd Embry had signed the petition. 3 of the 5 men who'd signed the complaint against her had received free parts from her barn. Edith let that fact sit in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't comment on it. She didn't need to. The ripples did the work. She closed the notebook. I've got more parts in that barn than Warren Pritchard has in his showroom, Edith said. But Warren charges 300% markup. I charge nothing. That's what this hearing is really about. Not safety, not zoning, not property values. This hearing is about a man who sells parts for a living being afraid of a woman who gives them away. The room erupted, not in anger, not exactly, in something closer to recognition. The sound that a room makes when something true is said out loud for the first time. Vernon Osgood gabbled for order. Warren Pritchard's face was the color of a ripe tomato. His brother-in-law was writing furiously on the legal pad, which was a waste of ink because there was nothing legal to write. Vernon wrote something on his clipboard. He looked at Edith. He looked at Warren. He looked at the 5 petitioners, 3 of whom appeared to be trying to become invisible. No violation found, Vernon said. The hearing was over in 20 minutes. Edith drove home. She changed out of the blue dress and hung it in the closet where it would stay for another 20 years. She went to the barn and spent the rest of the afternoon labeling a set of Farmall brake shoes with strips of masking tape. Nolan came out after supper and sat on his bucket and watched her work. He was 9 years old. He'd heard about the hearing from kids at school whose parents had been there. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood that his mother had stood up in front of the whole county and won. "Mom," he said, "what's a junkyard?" Edith didn't look up from the brake shoes. "It's what people call a place when they don't understand what it's for," she said. The junkyard stayed, but the name stayed too. Edith Calloway was the junkyard lady. Her ravine was the junkyard. Her barn was the junk shop. When people gave directions past Edith's place, they said turn left at the junkyard. When Edith's name came up at the co-op, someone always said, you mean the junkyard woman? Edith never objected. She never defended herself. She never explained. She just kept collecting, disassembling, labeling, storing. The years between the hearing and the crisis were the quiet years, the building years. The years when Edith did her work in the kind of silence that only a person who has been laughed at and survived can sustain. It's a specific kind of silence, not the silence of shame, not the silence of defeat, the silence of a person who knows something and is willing to wait for the world to catch up. Nolan grew up in that silence. He was 9 years old during the hearing, old enough to hear the whispers at school, old enough to know what the other kids meant when they said junkyard, old enough to come home one afternoon with a bloody lip because Tommy Rask, Donald Rask's boy, had called his mother the junk lady and Nolan had thrown the first punch of his life. Edith cleaned the blood off his lip with a wet cloth in the kitchen. She didn't ask what happened. She knew. Small towns don't keep secrets from mothers. Nolan, she said, you can't fight every person who says something about this place. I can try, Nolan said. He was 9 and furious and bleeding, and he meant it. Or you can do what I do. Let the work speak. Nolan looked at his mother. He was 9. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he remembered it. He carried those words with him the way a stone carries its shape permanently through everything that came after. He remembered it at 12 when he started helping in the barn after school, pulling parts from a dead Oliver 77 with a socket set that was almost too big for his hands. The wrenches were heavy, the bolts were rusted. Some of them required a breaker bar and all of Nolan's body weight hanging on the end of it. But the feeling when a bolt broke free, when a frozen fitting turned, when a part came loose, clean and whole, that feeling was something he never forgot. It was the feeling of winning, not against another person, against rust, against time, against the assumption that broken things are worthless. He remembered it at 15 when he rebuilt his first hydraulic pump by himself, following the shop manual, page by page, cleaning every component with diesel fuel, replacing the seals with new ones Edith had ordered from a supply catalog, and testing it on the bench rig. The bench rig was something Edith had built from an old electric motor, a pressure gauge, and a system of fittings that allowed her to run fluid through a pump or cylinder and measure its output. It was crude. It was effective. It told you everything you needed to know. Is the part good or isn't it? Nolan connected the pump, turned on the motor, and watched the gauge. It climbed, held steady at operating pressure, no leak, no drop. The pump was good. He looked at his mother, who was watching from across the barn. She nodded, that was all. A nod, but in that nod was everything. Approval, pride, welcome. He remembered it at 17 when a farmer drove up the lane on a Sunday morning with a broken alternator for a Farmall 806, and Nolan walked to the shelf, pulled the right can, and handed over the part before Edith even came out of the house. She found Nolan standing in the barn doorway, watching the farmer drive away. He needed an alternator, Nolan said. Third shelf, second row. I charged him $20. Wrote it in the book. Edith looked at her son. He was 17. He had Harold's jaw, Harold's hands. But the eyes were hers, the eyes that looked at a dead machine and saw life in the parts. She said nothing. But that evening, she added a note to the ledger next to the alternator entry. Nolan's first solo transaction. It was the only personal note in 4 volumes of strictly factual record-keeping. By 1978, her notebook listed 1,847 parts. The ravine held over 50 pieces of dead equipment. The barn was full, so Edith had built a second storage shed, a simple pole building with a dirt floor and more shelves. She'd done most of the construction herself. Nolan, who was 14 by then, mixed concrete for the footings and held the posts plumb, while Edith nailed the cross beams. They worked together the way a good crew works, without many words, with a shared understanding of what needed to happen next. She'd also started specializing. She noticed that International Harvester parts of Farmall tractors, IH combines, IH implements were the most requested, because IH equipment was the most common in central Iowa. It had been the dominant brand since the 20s. More farmers drove Farmalls than anything else, which meant more Farmalls were wearing out, which meant more Farmalls were dying, which meant more Farmall parts were needed. Supply and demand. Edith understood it instinctively, so she began actively seeking out dead IH machines. When she heard about a farmer scrapping a farmall, Edith was the first call. She'd drive her truck over, look at the machine, and almost always take it home. Not for the tractor, for the parts involved in it. There was a ritual to it. Edith would walk around the machine 3 times. First time looking at the body, the sheet metal, the frame, assessing the structural damage. Second time looking at the engine, the transmission, the hydraulics, assessing what could be saved. Third time with the notebook open, writing down every part she intended to pull, in the order she intended to pull them. She called it reading the machine. The way a doctor reads an x-ray. The way a librarian reads a catalog. Not just seeing what's there, but understanding what it means. What's worth saving? What's past saving? What's unique and what's common? What someone will need next year, or in 10 years, or in 20. By 1980, Edith's collection included parts for every major farmall model from the 1940s through the 70s. The H, the M, the Super M, the 300, the 400, the 460, the 560, the 650, the 706, the 806, the 1066. She had John Deere parts too, and Oliver and Alice Chalmers, and Massey Ferguson. But farmall was her specialty. Farmall was her library, and nobody cared. Because in 1980, you could still drive to Warren Pritchard's dealership in Eldora and buy a new fuel injector for a Farmall 706 for $68. Why would you drive to Edith's barn and dig through a coffee can when you could get a new part from Warren? Why would you trust a used injector pulled from a dead tractor when you could get a factory-sealed one in a box? The answer in 1980 was that you wouldn't, not unless you were stubborn or cheap or both. Nobody needed what Edith had, not yet. Not until the year that changed everything. Not until 1982. But before the crisis came, Warren Pritchard had one more card to play, and this one was personal. In the fall of 1981, Edith received a letter from First National Bank. Not from Frank Driscoll, who'd retired 3 years earlier and moved to a small house in Iowa Falls, where he spent his days reading Westerns and regretting nothing. From his replacement, a younger man named Thomas Winslow, who'd come from Des Moines and didn't know the history. Thomas was 38, educated, ambitious in the way that small-town bankers are ambitious, which means he wanted to move to a bigger town as soon as possible. He wore glasses and suspenders, and he'd hung his MBA diploma on the wall behind the walnut desk, which told you everything you needed to know about what he valued. The letter stated that the bank was conducting a review of all agricultural loans in the county, and that Mrs. Calloway's property would be reassessed in light of current conditions and the condition of the property. Edith read the letter twice. The phrasing was careful, legal, the kind of language that says one thing and means another. The letter said review. It meant threat. The letter said current conditions. It meant your junkyard is making us nervous. The letter said the condition of the property. It meant we've been told you've got dead tractors all over your land and we don't like it. She drove to town the next morning. Thomas Winslow sat behind the same walnut desk that Frank Driscoll had sat behind 17 years earlier. He had the same expression, the expression of a man who has already decided the outcome of the conversation, but is required by courtesy to have the conversation anyway. Mrs. Calloway, the bank has concerns about the condition of your property. We've received information suggesting that the accumulation of salvage material may be affecting the appraised value of your land, which serves as collateral for your operating loan. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our depositors to ensure that all collateral maintains adequate value. Information from whom, Edith asked. I'm not at liberty to disclose the source of from Warren Pritchard, Edith said. She didn't ask it. She stated it. The way you state that water is wet or that January is cold. Winslow paused. He adjusted his glasses. He said nothing, which was itself an answer. Edith reached into her purse. She pulled out an envelope, a plain white envelope unsealed. She laid it on the walnut desk between them. Inside was a cashier's check. That's the balance of my operating loan, Edith said. Paid in full, 17 years of payments, interest included. I saved it over 17 years from farming and from selling parts at fair prices to farmers who couldn't afford Warren Pritchard's markup. I don't owe this bank a dime anymore, which means you don't get to reassess my property. You don't get to have concerns about my salvage. And you don't get to do Warren Pritchard's errands. She stood up. My husband died because he couldn't afford a $68 part. I made sure no farmer in this county would ever face that choice. If Warren Pritchard has a problem with that, he can come tell me himself instead of sending a banker. She walked out. Thomas Winslow sat behind the walnut desk and stared at the cashier's check and the empty chair and understood, perhaps for the first time since he'd arrived in Hardin County, that he was not dealing with a woman who could be managed. He deposited the check. He filed the loan as paid in full. He never sent another letter to Edith Calloway. And the ravine kept filling, and the shelves kept growing, and the notebooks kept recording every part, every date, every name. Edith Calloway was 68 years old. She'd been called the junkyard lady for 15 years. She'd been laughed at, complained about, investigated by the county, and threatened by the bank. She'd lost her husband to a missing part and built an empire of found parts from the wreckage of other people's failures. And she was about to be proven right, because the answer was coming. It was coming in 1982, and it was coming with the force of a tornado. You know the story, or you think you do, the farm crisis. Those two words that landed on American agriculture like a hammer on glass. Interest rates hit 21.5%. Corn prices collapsed. Land values dropped 60% in 3 years. The numbers are so extreme they sound fictional, but they weren't fictional to the 300,000 American families who lost their farms between 1982 and 1987. They weren't fictional to the bankers who foreclosed, the auctioneers who sold, the lawyers who filed, the sheriffs who served the papers. They weren't fictional to the wives who packed boxes and the children who changed schools and the old men who stood at the end of their driveways and watched strangers drive their tractors away. In Hardin County, the crisis arrived the way it arrived everywhere. Slowly at first, a rumor, a whisper, interest rates are going up, then faster. A fact, rates hit 15%, then 18, then 20, then 21.5. The numbers climbed like a fever, and like a fever they destroyed what they touched. 47 farms in Hardin County were foreclosed between 1982 and 1986. 47 families who had worked the same ground for generations watched the auctioneers sell their tractors, their combines, their plows, their land, their future. One farm sale every 5 weeks for 4 years. You could set your calendar by the sound of the gavel. Edith went to some of those auctions. Not to buy. She couldn't afford to buy. She went to watch. She stood at the back of the crowd and watched the auctioneers sell a man's life in lots. Lot 1, the Farmall 7, 066,000 hours. Good tires needs a fuel injector. Lot 2, the John Deere combined 12-foot head, rusted auger functional. Lot 3, the land, 200 acres of black Iowa soil, going once, going twice. She watched the faces. The farmer standing in his own yard watching strangers bid on his equipment. The wife beside him, holding his arm, looking at the ground. The children confused, standing near the house that wasn't theirs anymore. After one auction in the fall of 1983, a farmer named Wesley Hodge walked up to Edith. Wesley was 62. He'd just watched his farm sell for 60 cents on the dollar. He was holding a cup of coffee that someone had given him, and his hands were shaking so badly the coffee was sloshing over the rim. Edith, Wesley said. His voice was barely there. I should have listened to you. I should have kept my old equipment running instead of buying new on credit. Warren Pritchard sold me a new combine in '79, $120,000. Borrowed every cent. Now the combine's worth $40,000 and I owe $90. That's the math that killed me. Edith didn't say I told you so. She didn't say anything about Warren or credit or the price of new equipment. She took Wesley's coffee cup and held it steady for him while he drank. Then she said, Wesley, do you still have your tools? He nodded. Good, she said. Bring them to my barn. I'll put you to work. Wesley Hodge spent 3 months working in Edith's barn that winter. He pulled parts. He cleaned them. He labeled them. He learned Edith's system. He didn't earn much, a few dollars a day, plus meals, but he had a place to go and something to do with his hands, and for a man who'd just lost everything, that was enough. But there's a piece of the farm crisis that doesn't get told enough. The historians talk about the debt. The journalists covered the foreclosures. The politicians debated the policy. Nobody talked about the parts. When the crisis hit, the first thing farmers stopped buying was new equipment. Tractor sales in Iowa dropped 40% between 1980 and 1983. Combined sales dropped 55%. Implement sales fell off a cliff so steep you couldn't see the bottom. The farmers who were surviving, the ones who hadn't been foreclosed on yet, were doing it by stretching every piece of equipment they had as far as it would go, running tractors past their service life, nursing combines through one more harvest, patching plows with baling wire and prayer, and the kind of creative engineering that happens when a man has no money and no choice. One Iowa farmer told a reporter in 1984, "All our tractors are getting a lot of age on them, but we'll keep them a few more years. You can put a lot of repairs into a machine for what it costs to buy." That sentence changed Edith Callaway's life. Because when farmers stop buying new equipment, they start fixing old equipment. And when they start fixing old equipment, they need parts. Warren Pritchard's dealership was the first to feel the squeeze. New tractor sales went from 22 units in 1979 to 4 in 1983 to 0 in 1985. Zero. Not a single new tractor sold in Hardin County in 1985. The showroom floor that had always held 6 or 8 shining machines held nothing. Warren took the floor mats out because there was nothing to put on them. The fluorescent lights buzzed over empty concrete. Warren survived on parts and service for a while, but even that was shrinking. Farmers were deferring maintenance, doing their own repairs, buying aftermarket parts from catalogs instead of genuine John Deere from Warren's counter, skipping the service appointment they used to schedule every spring and fall because $60 for an oil change was $60 they didn't have and $60 they'd rather spend on seed or fuel or the mortgage payment that was already 3 months late. In August of 1985, Warren Pritchard closed the John Deere dealership in Eldora. 28 years in business. Gone. The showroom was empty. The service bay was padlocked. The fluorescent lights were turned off. The parts counter, the counter where Warren had stood and mocked Edith Callaway's junkyard for 15 years, was bare. The bins behind it were empty. The parts catalog, a thick green binder with John Deere on the spine, was closed. Warren locked the door on a Friday afternoon. He peeled the John Deere decals off the front window, working carefully with a razor blade, pulling the green and yellow vinyl away from the glass in long strips. It took him an hour. When he was done, the window was clean, blank. The ghost of the logo remained a faint outline where the paint had faded around the decal lighter than the rest of the glass. You could see it if you knew where to look, if you'd driven past that window every day for 28 years and known what used to be there. Warren got in his blue Ford pickup. The truck still had the logo on the door. Pritchard Implement, John Deere Sales and Service. He didn't peel the logo off the truck. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he couldn't bring himself to erase the last trace. He drove home, and suddenly every farmer in Hardin County who needed a part for a tractor that was 10, 15, 20 years old had nowhere to go. The nearest remaining dealer was in Marshalltown, 45 minutes each way. And even Marshalltown didn't stock parts for older models. They stocked parts for the machines they currently sold, which were machines nobody was buying. You could order a part, 4 to 6 weeks delivery. 4 to 6 weeks when your tractor was down and the harvest was 2 weeks away, and the bank was calling about the mortgage. The silence was enormous. A county of 600 farms and not a single place to buy a fuel injector for a Farmall 706, or a hydraulic seal for a John Deere 4020, or a PTO bearing for an Oliver 88. The parts infrastructure that had supported central Iowa farming for decades had collapsed in 3 years, and nobody had a plan for what came next. Nobody except a 72-year-old widow with a barn full of coffee cans. The first farmer showed up at Edith's barn on a Tuesday morning in September of 1985. Luther Byrne, 67 years old, weathered face, deep creases around the eyes from a lifetime of squinting into Iowa sun, hands like leather, overalls that had been washed so many times the denim had gone from blue to white to something that had no color at all. Luther's Farmall 706 had a failed fuel injector, the same part that would have cost $68 at Warren's counter if Warren's counter still existed. Luther needed the tractor running for harvest. Harvest was 2 weeks away. Without the 706, he couldn't pull the corn picker. Without the corn picker, the crop stayed in the field. Without the crop, the bank called the loan. Without the loan, the farm was gone. The chain of failure that begins with one broken part. Harold Callaway had died in that chain. Luther Byrne was trying not to. Luther stood in the barn doorway, hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly the way men do when they're nervous or ashamed or both. He was looking at the shelves of labeled parts the way a man looks at a pharmacy when he's sick. The way a drowning man looks at a rope, Edith Luther said. His voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man holding himself together with will and habit. I need a fuel injector for a 706. Warren's closed. Marshalltown doesn't have one. They said 4 to 6 weeks on order. I don't have 4 to 6 weeks. I've got 2. Edith was at the workbench. She'd been testing a starter motor, running it on the bench rig, watching the armature spin. She shut off the motor. She looked at Luther. She didn't ask questions she already knew the answers to. She walked to the back of the barn, second shelf, third row. She reached into a coffee can labeled IH706 injectors. The can was a Folgers can, red with gold trim, the kind that half the kitchens in Iowa had on their counter. Inside were 2 fuel injectors, both clean, both tested on a compression rig that Edith had built from a hand pump and a gauge. Both ready, both labeled in her neat handwriting on strips of masking tape with the date she'd pulled them and the machine they'd come from. Take your pick, Edith said. Luther looked at the injectors, looked at Edith, looked at the barn, at the hundreds of cans and boxes and shelves, at the 20 years of collecting and organizing and labeling and waiting. How much, he asked. How much you got? Not much, then it's not much. Luther Byrne paid Edith $12 for a fuel injector that would have cost $68 new. He drove home, installed it in an hour, and his 706 was running by supper time. He brought in his harvest on time. He made his payment. He kept his farm. His family stayed on the ground they'd worked since 1912. $12, 1 part, 1 farm saved. That was Tuesday. By Friday, 3 more farmers had come to Edith's barn. By the end of September, 11 was. By Christmas of 1985, Edith Calloway had supplied parts to 37 farmers across Hardin County and 2 neighboring counties. Fuel injectors, hydraulic pumps, PTO shafts, water pumps, alternators, starter motors, brake shoes, steering cylinders, gauge clusters, seat springs, exhaust manifolds, thermostat housings, voltage regulators, clutch plates, pressure plates, parts that were unavailable at any dealer within 100 miles. Pulled from machines that had been sitting in Edith's ravine for years, some for decades, cleaned and tested in Edith's barn, and sold for whatever the farmer could afford. Let me tell you about some of the farmers who came that year, because the numbers only tell you the scale. The faces tell you the truth. There was Glenn Nordstrom, Earl's grandson, who came in October with the rear axle seal from a Farmall 806 crumbled in his hand like a dried leaf. His combine was sitting dead in the middle of 40 acres of standing beans, with frost coming in 3 days. If the beans weren't out before the frost, the pods would shatter and the beans would fall to the ground and Glenn would lose half his yield. Edith didn't have the exact seal, but she had a seal from an 856 that was close, almost identical. The same inner diameter, slightly different outer profile. She modified it on the workbench with a razor blade and a gasket punch, trimming the outer edge to fit the 806 housing, while Glenn watched and shifted his weight from foot to foot like a man standing on hot ground. 40 minutes. She handed it to him and charged $8. Glenn had his combine running by dark and finished his beans with 1 day to spare before the frost. There was Margaret Feldhahn, one of the only other women farming alone in the county. Her husband, Roy Feldhahn, had died of a heart attack in 1981, the year before the crisis hit, which meant Margaret had faced the worst of the downturn alone. She'd kept the farm the way Edith had kept hers, through stubbornness and skill, and the refusal to let anyone tell her she couldn't. Margaret's John Deere 3020 had a cracked exhaust manifold. The tractor was running rough, losing power, eating fuel. The crack let exhaust gases escape before they reached the muffler, which meant the engine couldn't breathe properly, which meant it worked harder for less output, which meant Margaret was burning twice the fuel for half the work. In 1985, she couldn't afford to waste fuel. Nobody could. Diesel was $1.10 a gallon, and every gallon counted. Edith pulled a manifold from a John Deere 3020 she'd salvaged in 1972. The manifold was clean, tested, solid, no cracks. She drove it to Margaret's farm herself because Margaret didn't have a working truck. The truck had been sold 6 months earlier to make a mortgage payment. Edith carried the manifold in the passenger seat of her own truck wrapped in a feed sack. "No charge," Edith said. Margaret cried, standing in the doorway of her machine shed holding a cracked manifold in one hand and a good one in the other. She cried. Edith told her to save the tears for something worth crying about, like a cracked block. A cracked manifold was just a Tuesday. There was young Caleb Lindgren, 24 years old, trying to keep his father's farm running after his father suffered a stroke in the summer of 1985. Caleb knew almost nothing about tractors. He'd been studying business at the community college in Marshalltown when his father collapsed in the barn one morning and was found by the milk truck driver an hour later. Caleb drove home that afternoon and hadn't left since. Suddenly, he was responsible for 320 acres in a farm all 1,066 with a failing transmission, in a John Deere combine with worn-out sieves, in a planter that needed new seed plates, in a mortgage that was 4 months behind. He came to Edith's barn not for a part, but for an education. He didn't know what was wrong with the 1066. He just knew the tractor made a sound it hadn't made before. A grinding, low, coming from somewhere near the back of the tractor when he engaged the PTO. "That's your PTO clutch pack," Edith said. She was sitting at the workbench cleaning a set of valve springs. She didn't even look up. The description was enough. A grinding sound near the back of a 1066 when the PTO engages. There was only one thing it could be. The friction discs are worn. If you keep running it, you'll damage the shaft, and then you're looking at a real problem. She didn't have a complete clutch pack, but she had 3 of the 5 friction discs from different machines, and she had a pressure plate from a 1066 she'd salvaged in 1976. She spent an afternoon teaching Caleb how to drop the PTO housing and replace the discs. She stood beside him in the cold November barn and guided his hands the way she'd guided Nolan's hands years before. Steady, patient, explaining not just what to do but why. "This bolt has a left-hand thread. Don't force it clockwise or you'll strip it. This bearing has a specific torque. Too tight and it'll seize. Too loose and it'll wear. Feel it." When it was done, the 1066 ran clean. The grinding was gone. Caleb stood beside the tractor with grease on his face and tears in his eyes and a feeling in his chest that he would later describe as the first time he felt like a farmer instead of a kid pretending. He paid Edith with a promise. "If you ever need anything, Mrs. Calloway, anything at all." Edith said she'd remember that. She did. The notebook tells the story of that year. Edith's ledger for 1985 shows 142 parts distributed, 63 Farmall, 31 John Deere, 22 Oliver, 14 Alice Chalmers, 12 Massey Ferguson, total income from part sales $4,800. Average price per part $33.80. Compare that to Warren Pritchard's dealer prices in his last year of operation. The same parts new would have cost an average of $150 each. Edith was saving farmers 70%, and she was the only source for many of the parts because the manufacturers had stopped producing them years ago. International Harvester had been absorbed by Case in 1985. The old Farmall parts were being discontinued one by one as the combined company focused on current models. Edith's barn held parts that existed nowhere else on Earth. Parts that lived in coffee cans because one woman had spent 20 years saving what everyone else threw away. Edith wasn't getting rich. $33 a part. 142 parts. That's not wealth, that's survival money. Edith was still farming her 240 acres, still growing corn and beans, still living modestly in the farmhouse she'd shared with Harold for 27 years. But the parts income covered her property taxes and the electric bill and the groceries and the gas for the truck, and that was more than a lot of her neighbors could say in 1985. What Edith was getting was something more valuable than money. She was getting proven right. Let me tell you about the moment it became personal, because every great story has a scene where the world tilts on its axis, where everything that has been building suddenly arrives, and this is the scene. March of 1986. The winter had been long. The kind of Iowa winter that doesn't just freeze the ground, but freezes the spirit. Gray skies for weeks. Temperatures that didn't climb above 20 for the entire month of January. Wind that came across the open prairie with nothing to stop it. No hills, no mountains, no forests, just flat ground from horizon to horizon, and the wind used every inch of it. The farmhouses creaked, the barns groaned, the cattle stood with their backs to the west and their heads down enduring. Edith was in the barn. She was rebuilding a water pump for a Farmall 560. A farmer from Grundy County had called the week before desperate. His name was Virgil, and he'd been farming 60 years since he was 15, and he'd never sounded desperate before, but he sounded desperate now. His 560 was the only tractor he had left. He'd sold the other two to make payments. The 560 was it, the last machine, and the water pump had seized. Without the pump, the engine would overheat in minutes. Without the engine, no spring planning. Without spring planning, the end of everything. Edith had found a matching housing from a 560 she'd salvaged in 1974. The housing was cast iron heavy with the IH logo embossed on the side. She was fitting new seals, the one component she couldn't salvage because rubber degrades. She'd ordered them from a supply catalog in Des Moines, $3.40 for a set of 4. The seals were the perishable part. But the castings, the impellers, the shafts, those were iron. Iron is patient. Iron waits. She heard a truck on the gravel drive. The particular crunch of tires on frozen gravel that you learn to identify in farm country, the way people in the city learn to identify the sound of their neighbor's car. This sound was different. Not a truck she knew. She looked up from the workbench. A blue Ford pickup. Faded. Familiar in shape but not in context, because this truck had never been in this driveway before. It had driven past on the road 1,000 times, the driver's head always turned away, but it had never turned in. On the door, the ghost of a logo. The vinyl letters had been peeled off, but they'd left their outline in the paint lighter than the surrounding blue, a shadow of what used to be. The outline read Pritchard Implement, John Deere Sales and Service. Warren Pritchard got out of the truck. He moved slowly, not from age, though he was 71 and not young, from weight. The invisible weight of a man carrying something heavy inside him that he'd rather set down but can't. He closed the truck door carefully, the way you close a door when you're in someone else's space and you know you don't belong there. He stood for a moment in the driveway looking at the barn, at the ravine beyond it, at the rows of dead machines, at everything he'd spent 20 years mocking. Then he walked toward the barn. Edith set down her wrench. She watched him approach. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The fact that Warren Pritchard was walking toward the doorway of the barn he'd called an eyesore on the farm he'd tried to get the county to shut down, that he'd tried to get the bank to foreclose, said everything that needed to be said. Volumes, libraries, 20 years of history compressed into the sound of his boots on the concrete floor. Warren stepped inside. He stopped. He looked around, and something happened on his face that Edith had never seen before. Not on Warren's face, not on any face that had entered this barn for the purpose of judgment. He looked at the shelves, at the labeled parts, at the coffee cans in their rows, each one marked with a make, model, and part name in Edith's handwriting. At the boxes on the floor rack, sorted by size and manufacturer. At the wall hooks holding PTO shafts and steering columns and hydraulic hoses. At the workbench with the water pump housing and the shop manual and the grease pencil and the roll of masking tape. At the cleanliness. Not clean the way a showroom is clean with wax and polish. Clean the way a workshop is clean with purpose. Every surface wiped. Every tool in its place. Every part accounted for. He looked at the organization, the system, the decades of care that Edith had invested in something that everyone, including Warren, had called junk. And Warren understood, standing in that barn on that March afternoon, with the late winter light coming through the west windows and the space heater humming in the corner, that he had been wrong. Not a little wrong. Completely wrong. Wrong in the way that matters. Wrong about what had value and what didn't. Wrong about who knew what they were doing and who was playing pretend. Wrong about a woman he'd underestimated for 20 years because she was a woman and because he was a fool. His eyes moved across the inventory, the way a man's eyes move across something he should have recognized a long time ago. There was no contempt in his face. There was something worse. There was understanding. I need a steering cylinder for a 402. Oh, Warren said quietly. He was farming his own ground now, the 20 acres behind the closed dealership. He'd kept a John Deere 4020 for his own use, the tractor he'd used for personal chores and property maintenance during the dealership years. The steering cylinder had blown. A simple failure common in 4020s of that vintage. The cylinder develops a leak at the rod seal, and once the seal goes, the steering becomes heavy, then erratic, then dangerous. The nearest dealer who stocked the part was in Des Moines, 90 miles each way. They wanted $185 for a new cylinder. And Warren Pritchard, the man who'd sold parts at 300% markup for 28 years, the man who'd built a business on the principle that the only good part is an expensive part, the man who'd called Edith's barn a junkyard and her work a liability, and tried to shut her down through the county, and the bank couldn't afford $185 for a steering cylinder. Edith didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't say any of the things she had every right to say. She walked to the second shed, the pole building she'd built with Nolan's help in 1978. She pulled a tarp off a shelf and produced a steering cylinder for a John Deere 402, clean, tested on the bench rig, ready to install, labeled with a strip of masking tape in her handwriting. D402 steering cylinder, pulled 1977, good condition. She carried it back to the barn and set it on the workbench next to the Farmall 560 water pump she'd been rebuilding when Warren arrived. How much Warren asked? $20. Warren reached for his wallet. His hands were shaking. Not from cold. It was March in Iowa, but the barn was warm. The space heater was running. The afternoon sun was coming through the west windows, casting long rectangles of gold on the concrete floor. His hands were shaking because he was buying a used part from the woman he'd called the junkyard lady. In the barn, he'd called an eyesore. On the farm, he'd tried to destroy. His hands were shaking because the last 20 years of his life had been built on the certainty that what Edith did was worthless, and he was holding a $20 bill that proved it wasn't. Edith took the bill, folded it, put it in the front pocket of her overalls. Then she looked at Warren Pritchard, and for the first time in 20 years, she spoke to him about something other than parts, Warren Edith said. Her voice was the same, steady, quiet. The voice that had read 87 names in the courthouse. The voice that had told Frank Driscoll to watch her. The voice that had told Thomas Winslow she didn't owe him anything. I want you to know something. I never collected this stuff to prove you wrong. I collected it because I knew. I knew in '66 the same way I know what the weather's going to do when the wind shifts, that someday someone would need what everyone else threw away. I didn't know when, I didn't know who, but I knew it would happen. She paused. The barn was quiet. The space heater hummed. A bird, some winter bird that had no business being in a barn, shuffled in the rafters. The thing about junk, Edith said, is that it's only junk until you need it. Then it's the most valuable thing in the room. Warren said nothing. He picked up the steering cylinder. He held it the way you hold something that has weight beyond its physical mass. He carried it to his truck. He put it in the bed, gently setting it down rather than dropping it. He got behind the wheel. He started the engine. He drove away without looking back. They never discussed it again. Not at the co-op, not at the elevator, not at the church where they both attended services on Sunday mornings and sat on opposite sides of the sanctuary. They never spoke of what happened in the barn that March afternoon. But Warren never called Edith's farm a junkyard again. And when someone at the co-op used the word old habits die hard in farm country, Warren would go quiet. He'd look at his coffee. He'd look at his hands, the hands that had shaken while holding a $20 bill. He'd say nothing, and the silence said everything. The crisis didn't end in 1986. It got worse before it got better, and Edith's barn got busier. 1986 through 1988 were the peak years. Edith distributed over 200 parts a year. Farmers drove from 3 counties away. Some came with specific part numbers written on scraps of paper torn from catalogs or shop manuals. Some came with the broken part in hand, holding it up like a specimen, hoping Edith had a match. Some came with nothing but a description. It's the thing on the left side of the engine that connects to the thing that goes to the hydraulics. It makes a whining sound when you turn left, but not when you turn right. And Edith, who had memorized her inventory the way a librarian memorizes a collection, would nod, consider the description, ask 1 or 2 clarifying questions, walk to a specific shelf or shed or corner, and produce the exact part. She was rarely wrong, not because she was infallible, but because she had spent 20 years learning the language of machines, and she spoke it fluently. She never turned anyone away. If a farmer couldn't pay, Edith traded. Labor for parts, grain for parts, fence work for parts. One farmer paid for a complete set of brake shoes for a Farmall 806 with 3 laying hens. Rhode Island Reds, good layers. Edith accepted without hesitation. She was happy about the hens, actually. Fresh eggs every morning. She told Nolan it was the best trade she'd ever made. Better than the guy who traded a bottle of homemade wine for a starter motor. The wine had been terrible. The eggs were excellent. It was during these peak years that something happened that Edith didn't expect. Something that tested her in a way the county hearing hadn't. A way Warren Pritchard hadn't. A way the crisis itself hadn't. Something that tested her as a mother. Nolan came home. It was the spring of 1987. Nolan was 23. He'd graduated from Hardin County High School in 1982, the same year the crisis began. While farms collapsed around him, he'd attended 2 years of agricultural college at Iowa State, studying agronomy and farm management. He'd done well. His professors had noted his unusual practical knowledge, his ability to diagnose mechanical problems that other students couldn't, his instinctive understanding of how machines worked. But Nolan had felt restless at Iowa State. The classrooms felt abstract. The textbooks described farming as a system of inputs and outputs, costs and yields, when Nolan knew farming was something else entirely. Farming was the sound a farmall makes when the engine is right, the feel of a hydraulic lever when the pump is strong, the weight of a fuel injector in your hand, and knowing by that weight whether it was a 7.06 or a 5.60. He'd left after 2 years. Not failed out, walked out. He took a job at the grain elevator in Iowa Falls, 20 miles north. The work was honest, the pay was adequate. He rented a small apartment above the hardware store and dated a girl named Ruth Ann who worked at the county assessor's office. He had a life. He had a trajectory. It pointed away from Hardin County and the 240 acres and the ravine full of dead machines. But the ravine was in his blood. You don't grow up labeling parts with a grease pencil from the age of 6 without it becoming part of who you are. You don't rebuild your first hydraulic pump at 15 and feel the pressure hold and forget what that felt like. You don't hand a farmer an alternator from the 3rd shelf, 2nd row, and watch the relief flood his face and pretend that moment didn't matter. Nolan had been driving home on weekends to help his mother. Every Saturday, sometimes Friday nights, he'd pull into the driveway at 10 o'clock, the grain dust still in his hair, and find Edith in the barn, working by the overhead light, sorting fittings, or testing a starter motor on the bench rig. She'd be there until midnight, up again at 5. Farming all day, Saturday parts work all Sunday, and Monday he'd drive back to Iowa Falls. She was 74 years old. She was doing the work of 3 people, and she was slowing down in ways that only a son would notice. The pause before she lifted a heavy casting, gathering herself, bracing. The way she held the workbench edge when she stood up too fast, waiting for her balance to steady. The morning she couldn't open a jar lid at breakfast and pretended she wasn't hungry rather than ask for help. He drove up the lane on a Saturday afternoon in April. Edith was in the barn sorting a box of Oliver hydraulic fittings that a farmer from Hamilton County had dropped off that morning, Mom Nolan said. I quit the elevator. Edith didn't look up from the fittings. She held an Oliver 88 fitting up to the light, checked the thread, set it in a bin. Why, she asked. Because you need help. You're 74 years old. You're farming 240 acres alone and running a parts operation that serves 3 counties. You're up at 5 and in the barn until 10. You're going to work yourself to death the way Dad worked himself to death, and I'm not going to stand in Iowa Falls weighing grain while that happens. Edith set down the fitting she was holding. She looked at her son. He looked like Harold. Same jaw, same hands, same way of standing in a doorway like he was holding up the frame. But the stubbornness in his eyes was hers. Nolan, I didn't build this so you could give up your future. You didn't build this so you could die in the barn either. I'm not dying, I'm sorting fittings. Mom, you fell asleep on the workbench twice last week. I know because Mrs. Lindquist saw your barn light on at 3 in the morning and called me. You weren't working at 3 in the morning. You were sleeping at the workbench because you were too tired to walk to the house. Edith said nothing, because it was true. She had fallen asleep on the workbench. Both times, not from illness, from exhaustion. The demand had outstripped what one person could manage. Farmers were calling daily. Parts needed to be pulled, tested, cleaned, cataloged. The notebooks needed updating. The shelves needed reorganizing. And the farming still had to happen. 240 acres of corn and soybeans don't plant themselves. She looked at Nolan and saw something she hadn't expected. Not pity, not obligation, not the dutiful grimace of a son doing what he feels he should. She saw passion, the same light she'd seen in her own reflection the first time she'd opened a shop manual and understood that a machine was just a collection of parts waiting to be understood. You can't stay, Edith said. You have a life, Ruth Ann. The apartment, the elevator's good steady work. This is my life, Nolan said. This is what I want. You taught me that understanding machines matters more than a degree. That knowing parts matters more than knowing theory. I didn't learn that at Iowa State. I didn't learn it at the elevator. I learned it here, in this barn, from you, and from Dad, even though I never knew him, because every part in this barn is something he would have kept. Every label is something he would have written. You built this for him, and you built this for the county, but you also built it for me. And I'm staying. Edith looked at her son for a long time. She thought about Harold, about the $68 part, about the promise she'd made to herself in 1964, standing at the edge of the ravine, that no farmer would die for a missing piece of iron. She hadn't made that promise so her own son could sacrifice his future. But she hadn't made it so she could do it alone either. She handed him a grease pencil and a strip of masking tape. Start with the Oliver fittings. 3/4 inch goes on the second shelf. 1/2 inch goes in the bin by the door. Nolan took the grease pencil. He sat down at the workbench beside his mother. He started labeling, and something in the barn shifted. Something that had been carrying the weight of one woman for 20 years was now carried by two, mother and son. The same hands, the same care, the same belief that every piece of iron deserved a second chance. Together, Edith and Nolan turned the salvage operation into something the county had never seen. They didn't have a computer. They didn't have a storefront. They didn't even have a phone listing. They had a barn, a shed, a ravine, 12 notebooks, and the accumulated knowledge of a woman who'd spent 21 years understanding what machines were made of, and a young man who'd been learning since before he could read. The pace increased. Nolan brought energy and youth and a willingness to drive further for machines. He'd heard about a dead farm mall in Story County 70 miles south. He'd be there by sunrise with the flatbed. And Oliver 88 being scrapped in Cerro Gordo County to the north. He'd make the trip on Saturday and be back before dark. A farmer in Pocahontas County had an entire line of dead combines behind his barn, 6 machines in a row, dating from the 60s to the late 70s. Nolan would spend the weekend stripping them, pulling every salvageable part, loading the truck twice, driving home in the dark with the headlights cutting through the corn dust haze. Edith stayed in the barn. She was the cataloger, the identifier, the memory, the brain of the operation. She knew where every part was. She knew what every part fit. She knew which machines shared components across model years and which had unique specifications that made parts non-interchangeable. Her mind was the database, and it was more reliable than any computer because it understood context and nuance. A farmer would describe a noise, and Edith would diagnose the part. A farmer would bring a broken piece, and Edith would identify not just the direct replacement, but 3 alternatives from other models that would also work with minor modification. By 1988, the crisis was easing. Not ending, easing. Corn prices recovered slightly. A drought in 1988 actually helped paradoxically. It raised commodity prices because scarcity drives price, which is one of the cruel ironies of farming, the farmer's worst enemy. Bad weather is sometimes his best friend at the elevator. Some farmers started buying equipment again cautiously, the way a man who's been burned reaches toward a flame. A new implement dealer opened in Iowa Falls, 20 miles north, carrying a limited line of Case IH, the merged company that had absorbed International Harvester. But Edith's barn didn't slow down, because something had changed in Hardin County. Something that went deeper than the crisis. Something that would last longer than the recovery. Farmers had learned what Edith had always known, that used parts properly salvaged and tested were not just cheaper than new parts. They were often better. A fuel injector from a 1967 farm mall that had run for 10,000 hours and still worked was, in Edith's view, a proven part. Battle-tested, reliable, with its weak points already exposed and survived. A new injector from a box was an unknown quantity. It might last 20,000 hours. It might fail in 200. You didn't know until it was in the machine and working under load. Edith had been saying this since 1966. Nobody listened until the crisis forced them to. Now they listened, and they kept listening, even after the crisis passed, even after new dealers opened, even after credit loosened and land values recovered and the gavel stopped falling at farm auctions. They kept coming to Edith's barn, not just because it was cheaper, because it was better, because Edith knew what she was talking about, because every part on those shelves had been tested by the only test that matters: years of actual use in the field under load, in the heat of summer and the cold of winter, in the dust and the mud and the rain. There was a moment in the fall of 1989 that Nolan remembered years later. A farmer from Story County had driven nearly 2 hours to pick up a hydraulic cylinder for a John Deere 4.3. Oh, he was a younger man, maybe 35, and he'd never met Edith before. He'd heard about her through the network, the 3 degrees of separation chain that was in farm country, practically a direct referral. The farmer walked into the barn and stopped. He stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves and the cases and the labeled boxes and the 12 notebooks on the workbench and the 2 people working, the old woman and the young man, mother and son, and something crossed his face that Nolan had seen before but never got tired of seeing. It was the look of someone encountering something they didn't know existed, something that shouldn't exist by any normal measure of what people do with their time and their land and their lives. And yet here it was, real, functioning, full of parts that nobody else could provide. "Ma'am," the farmer said. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since before you were born," Edith said without looking up. She was cleaning a set of valve springs. "What do you need?" the farmer told her. Edith set down the springs, walked to the second shed, and produced the cylinder. She told him the history of the part without opening a notebook. Pulled from a 4430 in 1979. Farm near Williams. Previous owner ran it for 8,000 hours before the tractor was retired for a blown head gasket. Cylinder was tested at bench pressure in 1981. Seals replaced in 1985. The farmer paid $35. He carried the cylinder to his truck and came back. "Can I ask you something? Why do you remember all of that about one hydraulic cylinder out of thousands?" "Because every part has a story," Edith said. "Where it came from, what it did, how long it lasted. If you don't know the story, you don't know the part. And if you don't know the part, you can't promise the farmer it's going to work." The junkyard lady had become something else entirely. Not a junkyard, not a salvage yard, a lifeline. And every coffee can on every shelf was proof that one woman had been right when the whole county was wrong. By 1990, Edith Calloway's operation had grown beyond what she'd ever imagined. And Edith Calloway was not a woman with a small imagination. The barn held over 3,000 catalog parts. The second shed held another 1,500. The ravine held 78 equipment carcasses arranged in rows by manufacturer. Farmall on the north side, John Deere on the south, everything else in the middle. The original notebook had been replaced by a set of 12 volumes, cross-indexed, covering every part Edith had acquired, distributed, or still held. Each entry in her neat handwriting. Each strip of masking tape written with the grease pencil that had become as natural to her hand as a pen. Nolan had been working alongside her for 3 years. They developed a rhythm, the kind of unspoken coordination that comes from shared purpose and shared blood. Nolan handled acquisition and logistics, the driving, the hauling, the heavy lifting of machines onto the flatbed. Edith handled identification, cataloging, testing, and the customers. She was the face and the mind of the operation. Nolan was the body and the engine. In 1992, they finally put an ad in the county directory, not because they needed customers, because Edith's neighbor, the widow Lindquist, the same woman who'd called Nolan when she saw the barn light on at 3 in the morning, had insisted. "Edith," she said one afternoon over the fence, "you're 79 years old and you're still making people drive out to the farm on the off chance you're home. Get a phone listing. It's not vanity, it's common sense." The ad was simple, 7 words and a phone number. Callaway Farm Equipment. Salvage. Used parts for all makes. Fair prices. Those 7 words changed the geography of the operation. The calls came from across the state and then from across the region. A tractor collector in Minnesota called looking for a dashboard cluster for a 1949 Farmall M. Edith had two. She described both by memory the condition of each gauge, the clarity of the glass, the function of the ammeter, and the oil pressure indicator. The collector drove down the following weekend and paid $40 for the one in better condition. He stood in the barn for an hour afterward, just looking at the shelves, shaking his head. An agricultural museum in Nebraska needed a PTO assembly for a display tractor, a Farmall H that they were restoring for an exhibit on Iowa farming in the 1940s. They called Edith expecting to negotiate. Edith shipped it free of charge. Nolan asked her why. Because museums preserve history, Edith said. That's what we do too. We just don't charge admission. A vocational school in Des Moines asked if they could bring students to Edith's barn to learn about equipment disassembly and parts identification. Edith said yes. And on a Saturday in October of 1993, she spent the entire day showing 23 vocational students how to take apart a Farmall 460 without damaging a single reusable component. She started with the engine and worked outward. She explained every bolt, every fitting, every junction between systems. She showed them how to read a casting mark and identify the date of manufacture. She showed them how to test a hydraulic pump with a hand gauge and a bucket of fluid. She showed them how to check a fuel injector by holding it to the light and looking for cracks in the tip. The students were astonished. They'd been trained on new equipment, computer diagnostics, electronic fuel injection, GPS-guided systems, equipment where the engine was covered by a plastic shroud and the computer was the first point of contact for any malfunction. Edith's barn was a museum of mechanical engineering where every problem had a physical solution and every fix required understanding how the machine worked from the inside out. Your generation fixes machines by replacing modules, Edith told the students. She was holding a fuel injector in one hand the way a teacher holds a piece of chalk. My generation fixes machines by understanding them. There's a difference. A module is a black box. You don't know what's inside. You just swap it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you swap another one. Shrum. A part is a thing you can hold in your hand. You can measure it, clean it, test it, understand it, reuse it. When you understand parts, you understand machines. When you understand machines, you don't need a dealer to tell you what's wrong. You know what's wrong, and you know how to fix it. One student, a young woman about 20 years old with grease already on her hands from the morning's work, raised her hand. Mrs. Calloway, how did you learn all this? Did your husband teach you? Edith looked at the young woman for a moment, and something passed across her face that the students couldn't read, but Nolan could. Grief, pride, defiance. All three at once layered on top of each other like sediment in a riverbank. 30 years of layers. My husband died because a tractor lacked a $68 part, Edith said. I taught myself everything after that. Shop manuals, trial and error, 27 years of taking machines apart and putting them back together. Nobody taught me, the machines taught me. If you listen to Iron, it tells you everything you need to know. The barn was quiet. The students stood among the shelves of labeled parts and the coffee cans and the notebooks and the accumulated knowledge of 3 decades, and they understood that they were standing in a classroom that no university could build and no textbook could replace. Now let me tell you about the test that almost ended it all. Because Edith Calloway had survived mockery. She'd survived the county hearing. She'd survived Warren Pritchard's campaigns and the bank's threats. She'd survived the farm crisis. She'd survived the quiet loneliness of being a woman who was right when everyone else was wrong, which is its own kind of burden, heavier than iron, more persistent than rust. But in 1996, something came for her that was bigger than Warren Pritchard, bigger than the county, bigger than the crisis, a corporation. The company was called Agricor Equipment Solutions, based in Omaha. They specialize in agricultural equipment salvage on an industrial scale. Warehouses in 4 states, Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, Minnesota. Computerized inventory. Online catalog, which in 1996 was a new and formidable thing. A fleet of trucks. Annual revenue in the millions. They'd heard about Edith Calloway the way everyone in the agricultural equipment world had heard about her through the network, through the reputation, through the slow accumulation of stories about a woman in Iowa with a barn full of parts that nobody else could find. A representative drove out in April. A man in his 40s named Bradley Fulton, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with the Agricor logo embroidered on the chest. He had a business card and a briefcase and a rental car and the polished demeanor of a man who acquires things for a living. He stood in the driveway and looked at the ravine and the barn and the shed and the pole building and the 83-year-old woman in overalls and work boots who came out to meet him with a grease pencil behind her ear. Mrs. Calloway, Bradley said. He extended his hand, firm grip, professional smile. Agricor would like to acquire your inventory and your property. We're prepared to offer $380,000 for the land, the buildings, and all salvage materials. That's approximately 3 times the current agricultural land value per acre. It's a significant premium. Edith shook his hand. She studied him the way she studied a machine, assessed his components, identified his function. $380,000, she repeated. That's correct. It's a very generous offer. You'd be able to retire comfortably. Your son could pursue other opportunities. We'd handle everything. The transition would be seamless. What would you do with it? We'd consolidate your inventory into our existing warehouse system in Omaha, digitize the catalog, list the parts online, ship nationally. We'd bring your operation into the 21st century. Professional packaging, quality assurance protocols, customer service representatives. What about the farmers who come here? They'd order through our online system. Same parts. Better access, actually. They could search our database from home and order with a credit card. At what price? Bradley Fulton hesitated. A small hesitation. The kind of pause a salesman makes when he knows the next number is going to be a problem. Market rate, he said. We typically price salvage parts at 60 to 70% of new retail. It's competitive. It's fair. It's significantly less than buying new from a dealer. Edith did the math in her head, the way she always did. Quickly, precisely. 60 to 70% of retail. A fuel injector she sold for $33 would cost 60 or 70 through Agricor. A steering cylinder she sold for 20 would cost 40 or 50. A hydraulic pump she sold for 40 would cost 80 or 90. So if Luther Burn needed a fuel injector, Edith said, instead of driving to my barn and paying $12, he'd go online and pay 70. I understand the adjustment might seem, it's not an adjustment, it's a betrayal. These farmers trust me because I charge fair. Fair isn't market rate. Fair is what a man can afford when his tractor's broken and his harvest is 2 weeks out and his family depends on the corn getting in. Fair is $12 for a fuel injector because $12 is what Luther Burn had in his pocket in September of 1985. And it was enough because I said it was enough, Mrs. Calloway. This is a very generous Mr. Fulton, Edith said. Her voice was the same voice it had been in the courthouse in 1973, and in the bank in 1981, and in the barn in 1986 when she spoke to Warren Pritchard. Steady, quiet, final. My husband died because he couldn't afford a $68 part. I built this operation so that no farmer in this county would face that choice. Not ever. You're offering me $380,000 to undo 30 years of that work, to take the parts off these shelves and put them behind a computer and a credit card and a market rate that these farmers can't afford. The answer is no. Bradley Fulton drove back to Omaha in his rental car. He wrote a report. He filed it. And Agricor, being what corporations are, did not accept no as a final answer. Corporations never do. What happened next was quieter than a county hearing and more dangerous than a bank letter. Agricor retained a lobbying firm in Des Moines. The firm began working with contacts at the Iowa Department of Natural Resources on new regulations for agricultural salvage operations. The proposed rules would require environmental impact assessments for any property holding salvage materials exceeding certain tonnage thresholds. They would require liability insurance at commercial rates. They would require formal permitting and annual inspections. Compliance costs for a small operation like Edith's would be $30,000 a year or more than her entire parts income. It would shut her down. The Hardin County Board of Supervisors was asked to consider a new zoning ordinance that would implement these regulations at the local level. The hearing was scheduled for October of 1996. Nolan found out from a friend in the county clerk's office. He drove to the farm that evening. "Mom," he said, "they're coming for us again." Edith was in the barn. She was always in the barn. She was 83 years old, and she moved more slowly than she had at 63, but she moved with the same precision, the same deliberation. Her hands still knew where every part was. Her mind still held the catalog. She was sharpening a set of cultivator shovels on the bench grinder, holding each one against the stone with a steadiness that belied her age. She listened to Nolan describe the hearing, the new regulations, the insurance requirements, the guns. Who's behind it, she asked. A company from Omaha, Agricor, the ones who offered to buy us out. Edith nodded. She turned off the bench grinder. The barn went quiet. I was expecting this, she said. Not them specifically, but something. There's always something in. There's always someone who looks at what we've built and sees dollars instead of purpose. When's the hearing? October 15th. That gives us 2 weeks. 2 weeks for what? To make phone calls. Edith Calloway spent the next 2 weeks on the telephone. She called every farmer in the ledger. All 12 volumes, every name. Some she reached directly. Some she reached through their wives or their sons or their neighbors. The conversation was always short. This is Edith Calloway. There's a hearing on October 15th. The county board is considering a zoning ordinance that would shut down the salvage operation. If you think what I do matters, come to the hearing. That was all. She didn't explain. She didn't argue. She didn't ask. She stated. And the farmers, the men and women who had come to her barn over 30 years with broken parts and broken hearts and empty wallets and left with what they needed, understood. The Hardin County Board of Supervisors met in the courthouse in Eldora on the evening of October 15, 1996, the same courthouse where Vernon Osgood had conducted the zoning hearing 23 years earlier. The same room, but the room was different this time. Not 40 people, 80. Farmers from Hardin County and 4 surrounding counties. Men who had driven 30, 40, 50 miles on a Tuesday evening in October because Edith Calloway had called. Or Nolan had called, or someone who'd gotten a call had called someone else. The network that had grown organically over 30 years activated in 2 weeks like a root system sending up shoots after a fire. They filled every seat. They stood along the walls. They spilled into the hallway. Some had driven straight from the field. They still had dirt on their boots and chaff in their hair and dust in the creases of their faces. They smelled like diesel and corn dust and the particular exhaustion of harvest season, which is a kind of exhaustion that goes beyond tired into a state of operating on will alone. The Board of Supervisors, 5 men in suits at a long table, looked at the crowd and understood immediately that this was not going to be a routine zoning vote. The chairman opened the floor for public comment, and one by one the farmers stood and spoke. Luther Byrne went first. He was 67 years old. He'd farmed in Hardin County for 41 years. In September of 1985, he said, "My Farmall 706 broke down 2 weeks before harvest. The fuel injector failed. Warren Pritchard's dealership had closed. Marshalltown couldn't help. They said 4 to 6 weeks for an order. I didn't have 4 to 6 weeks. I had 2. Edith Calloway sold me a fuel injector for $12. She pulled it from a coffee can on her shelf and handed it to me. If she hadn't had that part, I would have lost my crop. If I'd lost my crop, I'd have lost my farm. My family has been on that ground since 1912. 3 generations. Edith Calloway is the reason we're still there. If you shut her down, you're not just closing a salvage yard. You're closing the last place in central Iowa where a small farmer can get a part he can afford." He sat down. A farmer from Grundy County stood. Virgil. The man whose Farmall 560 water pump Edith had been rebuilding the day Warren Pritchard came to the barn. "I drove 70 miles for a water pump in 1986, Virgil said. Edith rebuilt it on her workbench while I waited. She charged me $15. The nearest other source was Des Moines, 4 hours round trip, and they wanted $140 for a new one. That water pump is still in my tractor." 10 years later, still running, Edith Calloway doesn't sell junk. She sells iron that works. If her operation closes, every small farmer within 100 miles loses their last affordable parts source. Another farmer stood. Glenn Nordstrom, the man whose combine had been saved by a modified axle seal. Another, Margaret Feldhahn, the woman who'd received a John Deere manifold delivered to her door at no charge. Another, Caleb Lindgren, now 35 and running his father's farm successfully. the young man Edith had taught to drop a peat-o housing on a cold November afternoon. 40 farmers spoke, 40 stories, 40 testimonials to what one woman's barn had meant during the worst agricultural crisis in half a century, and what it still meant a decade later to every farmer who couldn't afford dealer prices for a tractor that was 20, 30, 40 years old. The board voted unanimously to reject the new zoning ordinance. After the vote, one of the supervisors, a man named Gerald Phelps, who'd farmed in the county for 30 years before entering local politics, leaned into his microphone. For the record, Gerald said, "I'd like to note that this board received communications from an out-of-state corporation regarding the proposed ordinance. I'd like to further note that Hardin County zoning decisions are made by Hardin County residents, not by corporations from Omaha. And I'd like to thank Mrs. Calloway for 30 years of service to this community. What she has built is not a junkyard. It is an institution, and this board will protect it." The room erupted, not politely, not with applause, with something deeper. The sound of a community recognizing something that had been true for a long time and finally said aloud by someone with the authority to say it. The sound was gratitude and relief, and the particular roar that people make when they've been worried and the worry turns out to be unnecessary. Edith sat in the back row. She didn't stand. She didn't wave. She held her purse in her lap and looked at the floor and pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was feeling something too large for words, too large for the room, too large for a woman who had spent 30 years in a barn with coffee cans and masking tape and a grease pencil. Nolan sat beside her. He put his hand on her arm. They drove home in silence, the good kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that sits between two people who understand each other completely and have nothing to add to what has already been said. The years after 1996 were the quiet years, the years of steady work without crisis, the years of a woman growing old in a barn surrounded by the accumulation of a lifetime's conviction. Something unexpected happened in 1997. A blue Ford pickup drove up the lane. The same blue Ford, the ghost of the same logo, Warren Pritchard. This was not the Warren Pritchard of 1971, the man who stood at the co-op counter and mocked the junkyard lady. This was not the Warren of 1973 who orchestrated the county complaint. This was not even the Warren of 1986 who stood in the barn doorway with shaking hands and bought a steering cylinder for $20. This was a man of 73 who moved slowly and looked older than his years and carried something heavy in his chest that had nothing to do with weight. He parked the truck and walked into the barn where Edith was working. She looked up. She waited. Warren had come to her barn 3 times in 30 years. Each time, the ground between them had shifted. She waited to see what the ground would do this time. "Edith," Warren said, "I want to bring you my tools, my shop tools from the dealership. I've still got them. They're in my garage. Snap-on wrenches, a torque set, a hydraulic press, impact drivers. Good tools. Professional grade. Better than what you've got." Edith studied him, measured his components. "Why?" she asked. "Because I spent 20 years fighting you," Warren said, "and you spent 20 years being right. I can't undo the fighting. I can't take back the things I said at the co-op, or the complaint I filed, or the letter I had the bank send. I can't undo any of it. But I can make sure the tools go where they'll be used, where they'll matter." He brought the tools the following Saturday. 3 truckloads. Warren spent the afternoon helping Nolan organize them on a new tool wall in the 3rd building they'd added in 1995. They worked side by side, the old dealer and the young salvager, hanging wrenches on pegboard and sorting sockets into drawers. Warren didn't say much. He didn't need to. The tools said it. A man who had built his career selling new equipment was giving his best tools to a woman who had built her life-saving old equipment. It was as close to an apology as Warren Pritchard would ever come. And Edith accepted it the way she accepted everything, with a nod, a handshake, and a notation in the ledger. Warren Pritchard died in 1999. Heart attack. At his funeral in the same Methodist church where Harold Calloway's funeral had been held 35 years earlier, Edith sat in the back pew. She didn't speak. She didn't go to the reception afterward, but she was there. And Nolan, who knew his mother better than anyone alive, understood what that meant. It meant that Edith Calloway, who had been wronged by Warren Pritchard for 20 years, had forgiven him. Not with words. Words were cheap. With presence, which was everything. Edith slowed down after that, not suddenly, not dramatically, the way iron slows, gradually, by degrees. A machine doesn't stop all at once. It loses RPMs, it loses torque, it loses the responsiveness that tells you everything is turning the way it should. It still runs, it still works, but you can hear the difference if you know what to listen for. She stopped climbing into the ravine in 1998. Her knees wouldn't allow it anymore. The steep sides that she'd navigated for 30 years, grabbing sumac branches, placing her feet on limestone, became impassable. She stood at the rim and directed Nolan, pointing to specific machines, telling him which parts to pull. She stopped lifting the heavier parts in 2000. Anything over 20 pounds a Nolan handled. But she never stopped identifying, never stopped cataloging, never stopped sitting at the workbench with a grease pencil and a strip of masking tape labeling parts with the same neat handwriting she'd used in 1966. The handwriting hadn't changed. It was the one thing about Edith that time couldn't touch. She had a routine in those final years. Up at 5:30, coffee in the kitchen, standing at the window looking at the barn. The barn light would already be on. Nolan started earlier than Edith now, which was a reversal that neither of them mentioned, because mentioning it would mean acknowledging what it meant. Out to the barn by 6, sit at the workbench and work until noon. Lunch in the house listening to the farm report on the radio the way she'd listened every day since 1964. Back to the barn from 1 to 4. Supper, then the ledger. Every evening she sat at the kitchen table and updated the notebook. Parts in, parts out. The inventory of a lifetime recorded in the handwriting of a lifetime. Nolan tried to get her to use the computer he'd bought in 1999. She refused. Not out of stubbornness, though she had that in abundance. Out of principle. A computer can crash, she told him. A notebook doesn't crash. A notebook is there when the power goes out and the screen goes dark and the world stops making sense. A notebook is permanent. It doesn't need electricity or updates or passwords. It needs a pencil and a hand and the willingness to write things down. She was right about that too. She was right about most things, which was both her greatest strength and her heaviest burden. In 2001, at the age of 88, Edith developed a cough that wouldn't go away. A dry cough. Persistent. She ignored it for 3 months the way farm women ignore everything that doesn't directly threaten the livestock or the equipment. Pain was background noise. Fatigue was normal. A cough was just a cough. Nolan finally insisted. He drove her to the doctor in Iowa Falls, the same town where he'd worked at the grain elevator before coming home. The doctor was younger than Nolan. He ran tests. He made phone calls. He came back into the exam room and sat down and used the word that changes everything. Edith listened. She nodded. She asked one question. How long? Maybe 2 years, the doctor said. Maybe more. Maybe less. We can discuss treatment options. That's enough, Edith said. Mrs. Calloway, there are treatments that could. 2 years is enough, Edith said. She stood up. She put on her coat. She thanked the doctor for his time. She drove home. She went to the barn. She opened volume 12 of the notebooks, the current volume, and made an entry. Not a parts entry, a personal one. The only personal entry since the one about Nolan's first solo transaction 15 years earlier. Doctor says 2 years. Have approximately 400 parts still to catalog from the Morton Estate Hall. Should be enough time. The Morton Estate Hall was the last big acquisition. Old Willis Morton had died in the spring of 2001, and his family had called Edith because the farm was being sold and there were machines, a dozen of them dating back to the 50s. Nolan had made 3 trips with the flatbed. The parts were stacked in the 3rd building, unsorted, uncatalogued, waiting. Edith cataloged every one of those 400 parts. She did it the way she'd done everything since 1966. Carefully, methodically. Each part cleaned, tested, labeled, and placed on its proper shelf or in its proper can. She worked slower than she had in her 60s. The cough interrupted her. Some mornings she couldn't grip the wrench. Some afternoons the fatigue was so heavy she had to rest on the stool with her head against the workbench and her hands flat on the surface, just breathing. But she finished. It took her 14 months. She completed the last entry in March of 2003. The last part she cataloged was a thermostat housing from a Farmall 560. Small, cast iron, 2 pounds. She cleaned it with diesel fuel and a rag. She tested the spring mechanism. She labeled it IH560 thermostat housing. Morton Estate, March 2003. Good condition. She placed it in a coffee can on the shelf with the other thermostat housings. She closed the notebook. She set the grease pencil down on the workbench. Then she sat there for a long time, her hands flat on the surface where she had worked for 37 years. The surface was worn smooth by her hands and Harold's hands before hers. The wood had absorbed decades of oil and grease and diesel fuel until it was the color of dark honey and had a smell that was part barn and part history. She looked at the barn, at the shelves, at the cans, at the 12 volumes of notebooks stacked on the corner of the bench, at the tools on the wall, including Warren Pritchard's snap-on wrenches that hung on the pegboard in the third building, at the grease pencil worn to a stub, the latest in a succession of grease pencils that stretched back to 1966. She looked at all of it the way you look at something you love when you know you are seeing it for the last time. She stood up. She turned off the workbench light. She walked to the house. She made supper for Nolan. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd sat with Harold, the same table where she'd opened the first notebook, the same table where she'd updated the ledger every evening for 37 years. She told Nolan where the last 400 parts were stored and which shelves still needed reorganizing. She told him about a farmer in Wright County who had called about a Farmall 1066 starter motor and hadn't picked it up yet. The starter was in the third building top shelf east wall, behind the box of John Deere voltage regulators. She told him the Morton Estate thermostat housing was the last entry in Volume 12. If he needed to start Volume 13, the blank notebooks were in the top drawer of the desk in the living room. Then she told him she was tired, and she went to bed. Edith Callaway died on a Wednesday morning in September of 2003. She was 90 years old. She'd farmed 240 acres for 66 years. She'd collected salvage equipment for 37 of them. She'd never borrowed money for equipment after paying off the loan in 1981. She'd never bought a new tractor in her life. She'd driven a succession of used Farmalls, each one assembled, partly from parts she'd pulled from machines in the ravine for her entire farming career. She died in the farmhouse, in the bedroom she'd shared with Harold for 27 years, and then slept in alone for 39. Through the bedroom window, she could see the barn. The barn light was on. Nolan was in there sorting parts. He always started early now. Had for years. The last thing Edith Callaway saw was the light in the barn where everything she believed in was stored on shelves, in cans and boxes, in 12 volumes of handwritten records. A yellow light. Warm. Steady. The light of work being done. Nolan found her at 7:15 when he came in for coffee. She was peaceful. Her hands were folded on the quilt that her grandmother had made in 1920, the one with the double wedding ring pattern in blue and white. Her face was turned toward the window, toward the barn. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church in Eldora. The church held 150. Over 200 came. They drove from 5 counties. They parked on the street and in the church parking lot and on the grass beside the cemetery. Farmers in clean shirts and pressed pants and boots that had been polished for the first time in months. Their wives beside them. Their children quiet. The minister spoke. He said the expected things about faith and rest and reunion. Nolan spoke briefly. He stood at the lectern and looked out at the faces, the sea of weathered faces and calloused hands, and he said what his mother would have said. Mom would have thought this ceremony was a waste of everyone's time. She'd have told you all to go home and check your equipment, because something always needs fixing, and standing in a church doesn't fix it. Nobody laughed, because it was true, and because it was exactly what Edith would have said, and because the truth of it, the bone-deep accuracy of a son who knew his mother completely, was not funny. It was holy. After the funeral, 37 farmers drove past the Callaway farm. They didn't stop. They didn't turn in. They just drove slowly down the county road past the ravine and the barn and the house with the light in the window, the way people drive past a place that has meant something. Some lifted a hand off the steering wheel. Not a wave, a salute. The farmer's farewell. One hand raised briefly and then returned to the wheel. Nolan stood in the barn doorway and watched them pass, one by one, 37 trucks. He counted them. His mother would have counted them too. Nolan took over the farm and the salvage operation. By 2003, the inventory had grown to over 6,000 catalog parts. The ravine held nearly 100 equipment carcasses. The operation was known across central Iowa and beyond not as a junkyard anymore, but as what it had always been: a salvage yard, a parts source, a lifeline, a place where farmers went when nobody else could help. Nolan kept the notebooks. He transferred the catalog to a computer in 2005, a concession to the times that his mother would have tolerated but never embraced. She would have sat at the workbench and watched him type and said something about how the computer doesn't know what a fuel injector feels like. And she would have been right, but the computer could search 4,500 parts in 3 seconds, and Nolan's memory, good as it was not his mother's. Nobody's memory was his mother's. The original notebooks, all 12 volumes, he stored in a fireproof cabinet in the farmhouse. The cabinet was rated for 2 hours at 1,600 degrees. Nolan figured that was enough. 12 volumes, 37 years, one woman's handwriting, a complete record of everything Edith Callaway had saved and everyone she had helped. The record was the operation's soul. The computer was its brain. You needed both. But if the house burned and he could only save one, Nolan would save the cabinet. Without question, without hesitation. In 2008, the Des Moines Register sent a reporter to Hardin County to write about the salvage operation. The reporter was a young woman named Sarah. She spent 2 days at the farm. She walked the ravine, picking her way along the rows of dead machines, photographing the rusted iron against the green of the ravine walls. She toured the barn. She opened coffee cans and read the labels. She counted the cans. There were over 400. She opened one at random. IH560 thermostat housings. Inside were 6 thermostat housings, each one clean, each one tested, each one waiting for the day someone needed it. Some of the masking tape labels had yellowed. The grease pencil had faded on a few, but the handwriting was still legible, still neat, still the hand of a woman who didn't waste a stroke. She sat with Nolan at the kitchen table and listened to the whole story. Harold, the pump, the ravine, the hearing, Warren, the crisis, Luther Byron. The $12, the steering cylinder, the $20, Agricor, the board vote, the tools, everything. The headline ran across the front of the features section. The farm that saves farms. How one Iowa family's salvage yard became the Midwest's last resort for tractor parts. The story ran long, 2,000 words. Photographs of the ravine and the barn and the coffee cans and the notebooks. A photograph of Nolan holding Volume 1 open to the first page. Callaway Farm Equipment Salvage. Inventory Volume 1. Edith's handwriting. 37 years of history, beginning with 7 words. The reporter asked Nolan what his mother would have thought about the article. She'd have thought it was a waste of newspaper ink, Nolan said. She didn't collect parts for attention. She collected them because she couldn't stand watching good iron go to waste. Every piece of metal that went to the scrap man was a piece of metal that some farmer someday was going to wish he had. Mom just made sure it was here when they needed it. The reporter asked one more question. She had her notepad out and her pen ready, and she asked it the way reporters ask the question they have been saving. The one that matters. What's the most valuable thing in the barn? Nolan thought about it. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Through the window, the barn was visible, its white paint peeling its roof slightly, bowed its doors open, the way they were always open during the day. He stood up. He walked to the barn. The reporter followed. Nolan walked to the original shelf. Shelf 1, row 1. The first shelf Edith had built in 1966 from 2x4s and plywood scraps. The wood had darkened with age. The shelf bowed slightly under the weight of decades. But it was solid. It would hold for decades more. He reached up and pulled down a coffee can, a Folgers can, red with gold trim. The label was faded but readable. Written in a grease pencil on masking tape and handwriting that the reporter had seen on 400 other cans, but that felt different on this one. IH460, injectors, the first can Edith had ever labeled, from the first tractor she'd ever salvaged. Hank Mercer's Farmall 460 with the cracked block, the tractor that started everything. Nolan opened the can. Inside was one fuel injector, the last one. The others had been sold over the years, distributed, given away, traded. sent out into the county and the state to keep machines running and farms alive and families on their land. But this one remained, the last injector from the first can. Nolan held it up. This, he said, he turned it in the light. The metal was clean. The tip was clear. Edith had tested it. Edith had cleaned it. Edith had put it back in the can and kept it on the first shelf, one row one for 37 years. Not because of what it's worth, Nolan said, because it's where it all started. One woman looked at a dead tractor and saw parts instead of junk. That's the whole story. Everything else, the barn, the ravine, the notebooks, the 4,000 parts on the shelves, the 40 years, all of it follows from that one moment. A dead tractor in a ravine and a woman who wouldn't let it go to waste. He put the injector back in the can. He put the can back on the shelf one, row one, where it had been since 1966. That's the whole story, he said again. And it was. The salvage yard is still running. Nolan's son, Garrett, the third generation, joined in 2016. He was 22 years old. He'd grown up the same way Nolan had, sorting parts, learning the weight and feel of iron, understanding that every piece of metal has a history and a future. Garrett brought something new to the operation. He'd studied computer science at the community college, and he built a database that cross-referenced the handwritten notebooks with a digital catalog. He could search the entire inventory in seconds, but he also kept the notebooks. He understood what they meant. They weren't just records. They were proof that someone had cared enough to write things down by hand for 37 years. The ravine is full, the barn is full, the second shed is full. They've built a third building, the same one that holds Warren Pritchard's tools on the pegboard wall. The notebooks are in the fireproof cabinet, 12 volumes. The grease pencils are in the top drawer of the workbench next to a roll of masking tape. And every week a farmer drives up the lane, parks beside the ravine that everyone used to call the junkyard, walks into the barn, and asks for a part that nobody else in the state of Iowa can provide. The answer is almost always yes. Because Edith Calloway spent 20 years collecting what everyone laughed at. She spent 20 years being called the junkyard lady, the junkyard woman, the widow with the eyesore on the North 40. She spent 20 years filling coffee cans with parts that had no value until the day they had all the value in the world. The dealer laughed. The county complained. The neighbors shook their heads. A corporation tried to buy her out, and when she refused, they tried to shut her down. And 80 farmers stood up in a courthouse and said no. Not her, not this, not ever. The barn is still full. The parts are still labeled. The farmers are still coming. There's a line that Edith said once, and Nolan remembers it the way he remembers everything his mother said, which is to say perfectly, because she didn't waste words and every word she spoke was worth keeping. She said it on a winter evening in the barn after a long day of sorting parts, when the space heater was humming and the barn light cast yellow squares on the snow outside the windows, and the cold pressed against the walls like a living thing trying to get in. Harold died because someone threw away a part that someone else needed. Edith said, I decided that as long as I was alive, that wouldn't happen again. Not in my county, not on my watch. She paused. She was holding a fuel injector in her hand. Clean, tested, labeled, ready. The same kind of part that could have saved her husband's life. The same $68 piece of iron that had started everything. Every piece of iron in this barn is a promise, she said. A promise that when the day comes, when the tractor breaks and the harvest is close and the money is tight and the dealer is closed and the catalog says 4 to 6 weeks, someone will have what you need. Not a dealer, not a corporation, not a computer, a neighbor. Someone who saved what you threw away because she always knew that the day would come. The day always comes, and when it does, the answer is on a shelf in a barn in Hardin County, Iowa, in a coffee can with a strip of masking tape, written in the hand of a woman who saw treasure where everyone else saw junk. That's what happens when one person refuses to throw away what matters. The iron remembers, even when everyone else forgets.